Every quiet night reveals something daylight is remarkably good at hiding. The room grows still, the conversations come to an end, the responsibilities of the day loosen their grip. The endless stream of information finally falls silent. Then, almost without warning, the mind begins returning to the thoughts it never truly resolved. A memory surfaces, a regret you believed was behind you, a conversation that still feels unfinished, a fear that quietly followed you through the day without ever fully disappearing. It can seem as though the night created these thoughts, when in reality the silence has simply uncovered what distraction kept hidden all along. Unfinished emotions have a way of asking for attention once there is nowhere left to run. During the day, distraction can easily feel like healing. Staying busy creates the comforting illusion that yesterday no longer matters. Days become weeks, routines continue, responsibilities demand attention, and life keeps moving forward. But the mind doesn't measure recovery by the passing of time. It measures it through understanding. Anything left unexplored quietly follows you into tomorrow, shaping your mood before breakfast, influencing your reactions before you notice them, and guiding your decisions long before you realize it. This is why two people can experience the same setback, yet carry it in completely different ways. One slowly learns to put it down. The other unknowingly carries it into every new day. Restlessness replaces peace. Sleep becomes escape instead of restoration. Morning arrives, and it feels as though nothing has changed, unaware that the same emotional patterns have been quietly rehearsing beneath the surface all along. The Stoics knew that the quality of life is shaped by the quality of thought. That insight becomes especially meaningful when the world grows quiet enough for your own mind to be heard clearly. Perhaps the greatest purpose of the night is not simply to recover from the day, but to decide which parts of it deserve to continue living inside you. The final thoughts you carry into sleep rarely remain there. They settle deeper, becoming part of the lens through which tomorrow is experienced. Little by little, they shape your attention, your emotions, and eventually the person you become without ever announcing that the transformation has already begun. Perhaps the quiet hours were never meant to be escaped at all. Perhaps they are the one part of the day where the mind becomes honest enough to release what no longer belongs there, allowing tomorrow to begin long before morning ever arrives. People believe sleep exists to restore the body, to ease tired muscles, quiet aching joints, and prepare them for another demanding day. They measure a good night by how many hours they remained unconscious, or how refreshed they feel after waking. Yet there is another kind of restoration taking place beneath the surface, one that quietly shapes the quality of your life long before you notice its effects. While the body lies still, the mind continues arranging experiences, sorting emotions, strengthening habits, and deciding which thoughts deserve to become part of tomorrow. That process rarely attracts attention because it happens silently. There are no alarms announcing it and no visible signs that it has begun. Even so, each evening becomes a quiet crossroads. One direction carries unresolved anger, disappointment, fear, and self-judgment further into your future. The other slowly loosens their grip, allowing the mind to wake lighter than it was the day before. The difference is rarely found in sleep itself. It begins with what you bring into the silence before sleep arrives. Many people spend the final moments of the day surrounded by distractions. A glowing screen fills the room. Another video starts automatically. Messages continue arriving. News replaces stillness. Even exhaustion becomes something to escape rather than understand. At first, these habits seem harmless because they create temporary relief from difficult thoughts. The mind feels occupied, and occupied often feels peaceful. But there is an important difference between quieting the mind and silencing it. One creates understanding, the other postpones it. Marcus Aurelius warned that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Whatever remains hidden beneath constant distraction does not disappear simply because attention moves elsewhere. It waits patiently. Then, when the room grows dark and nothing else demands your focus, those unfinished emotions quietly return. A conversation from earlier in the day begins replaying. A mistake you believed was forgotten suddenly feels vivid again. A worry about tomorrow grows larger than it appeared only an hour before. It can feel as though the night created these thoughts, when in reality, the night simply removed everything that had been covering them. That realization changes the way you see those restless moments. Instead of viewing them as interruptions to peaceful sleep, they begin to look more like invitations. The mind is revealing what it has been carrying all along. During the rush of ordinary life, there is rarely enough stillness to notice what continues shaping your emotions beneath awareness. Responsibilities arrive one after another. Deadlines demand attention. Conversations pull your focus outward. By the time evening comes, you may believe the day is finished simply because the tasks are complete. Yet, the inner experience of the day often remains unfinished. Feelings that were ignored continue searching for resolution. Judgments made in passing quietly settle into belief. Repeated often enough, those beliefs become the lens through which tomorrow will be experienced. This is why emotional habits rarely appear dramatic. They are built through ordinary evenings that feel almost identical to one another, each one adding another layer to the way you interpret yourself and the world around you. Stoic philosophy approached this reality with remarkable simplicity. Rather than treating the end of the day as an opportunity to escape from life, it treated the quiet hours as an opportunity to understand it. Reflection was never intended as punishment or endless self-criticism. It was an act of careful observation. Before allowing another day to begin, the mind was invited to examine what deserved to remain and what deserved to be released. That practice required honesty without harshness. You could acknowledge disappointment without allowing it to become your identity. You could recognize failure without deciding that failure defined your character. You could notice anger without feeding it until it shaped tomorrow's behavior. This quiet discipline does not demand perfection. It asks only for awareness. Awareness creates space, and within that space, different choices gradually become possible. Perhaps this explains why two people can experience similar difficulties, yet wake carrying entirely different emotional burdens. One falls asleep rehearsing every insult, every regret, every fear of what tomorrow might bring. The other spends a few quiet moments placing each experience where it belongs, accepting what cannot be changed while refusing to let temporary emotions become permanent companions. Their circumstances may look identical from the outside, but their inner worlds are already moving in different directions. Night after night, those small differences accumulate. Calm becomes easier for one because it has been quietly practiced. Restlessness becomes familiar for the other because it has been quietly repeated. Neither outcome appears overnight. They grow gradually through the thoughts chosen when nobody else is watching, during the final moments before consciousness gently gives way to sleep. The remarkable part is that this process remains available every single evening. No extraordinary circumstances are required. No perfect day must come first. The opportunity arrives whenever the noise begins fading and the mind finally has room to speak honestly. Instead of fearing that silence, you can learn to welcome it with quiet curiosity. Beneath the unfinished conversations, beneath the lingering disappointments, beneath the endless movement of daily life, another possibility has been waiting patiently all along. Each night offers the chance to place unnecessary burdens down before carrying them into another morning. Over time, that simple habit begins changing something much deeper than the quality of your sleep. It slowly changes the person who opens their eyes when the new day begins. Long before your head reaches the pillow, something far more important than sleep has already begun. The mind has been collecting impressions since the moment you opened your eyes that morning. Every conversation, every disappointment, every quiet victory, every careless remark, every anxious prediction, and every repeated thought has left a subtle mark. Most of these moments seem too ordinary to matter. You move from one responsibility to the next without stopping to examine what each experience leaves behind. But the mind is always paying attention, even when you are not. It quietly decides which emotions deserve another rehearsal and which beliefs are becoming familiar enough to feel like truth. By the time evening arrives, much of tomorrow has already started taking shape because of the patterns you practiced today. This happens so gradually that it rarely feels like a choice. A single anxious thought appears before an important conversation, then returns later while driving home, and surfaces once again as you prepare for bed. Hours pass between each appearance, making them seem unrelated, yet together they begin forming a story. Before long, uncertainty becomes expectation. Doubt becomes identity. The mind stops treating these thoughts as passing visitors and starts welcoming them as permanent residents. That transformation doesn't happen because the thoughts are accurate. It happens because they are familiar. Repetition has a remarkable way of disguising assumption as reality, especially when no one pauses long enough to question what is quietly being practiced beneath the surface. If these reflections are helping you see your own mind more clearly, take a moment to subscribe. By doing so, you're making a commitment to cultivating greater clarity, discipline, and inner peace through timeless Stoic wisdom. Now, let's continue and explore what begins to change when this quiet practice becomes part of your life every single night. Many people believe they think freely throughout the day, yet much of their inner dialogue follows the same predictable path. The same worries appear before similar situations. The same disappointments replay whenever the mind grows quiet. The same fears return with slightly different faces, creating the illusion that new problems have arrived when the emotional pattern has remained unchanged all along. This explains why two different experiences can produce nearly identical emotional reactions. The circumstances may change, but the story underneath often stays exactly the same. The subconscious recognizes familiar emotional territory long before conscious awareness notices it, and it continues following those familiar paths because they require the least effort. The mind naturally returns to what it has practiced the most, regardless of whether those habits lead toward peace or unnecessary suffering. As daylight slowly gives way to evening, those repeated thoughts do not simply disappear because your responsibilities have ended. They continue gathering quietly beneath awareness, waiting for the moment when external distractions finally lose their influence. This is why the final hours before sleep often feel emotionally heavier than the rest of the day. It isn't because new burdens suddenly appeared. It is because the noise surrounding them has become quieter. Without endless conversations, constant notifications, or demanding schedules pulling attention in different directions, the mind naturally returns to whatever remains unresolved. Some people interpret this as overthinking, while others become frustrated that they cannot simply switch their thoughts off. In reality, the mind is doing exactly what it has been trained to do. It is continuing the emotional conversations that began hours earlier, carrying them forward until they either find understanding or become tomorrow's unfinished business. The Stoic approach begins by recognizing that this process is neither mysterious nor unfair. The mind reflects whatever it repeatedly receives. Just as a path through a forest becomes easier to follow each time someone walks across it, repeated thoughts slowly carve pathways that future thoughts begin following automatically. Left unattended, those pathways become habits. Habits become character. Character quietly shapes the way you interpret the world without announcing that it has taken control. This is why awareness matters so deeply. You cannot redirect a path you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot loosen the grip of a belief while pretending it has no influence. The first act of discipline is not forcing the mind into silence. It is learning to observe where it naturally travels when nothing else is demanding its attention. That observation often reveals something surprising. The thoughts repeated most frequently are not always the ones that deserve the greatest attention. Sometimes they are simply the loudest. Fear has a way of speaking with urgency. Regret insists that it must be replayed one more time before it can finally be understood. Self-criticism presents itself as responsibility, convincing you that harshness is the same as growth. But repetition alone never transforms a thought into wisdom. Many people spend years mentally rehearsing the same disappointments without becoming any wiser, because reflection and repetition are not the same thing. One creates understanding. The other strengthens emotional habit. Knowing the difference quietly changes the relationship you have with your own mind. As this becomes clearer, the purpose of the evening begins changing as well. Instead of allowing the subconscious to continue writing tomorrow from the emotional patterns of today, you begin creating a small space between observation and acceptance. You notice the stories asking to be repeated without automatically believing every word they contain. Some deserve further reflection. Others have simply overstayed their welcome. This quiet act of discernment may appear insignificant from the outside, but over weeks and months it changes something remarkably deep. The subconscious gradually learns that not every passing thought deserves another rehearsal. Some can simply arrive, be acknowledged with honesty, and then be allowed to leave. Night after night, that simple practice begins rewriting the inner story long before sleep finally arrives, allowing tomorrow to be shaped less by unconscious repetition and more by deliberate awareness. This is why unresolved emotions rarely disappear, simply because enough time has passed. Time moves forward regardless of whether the heart has caught up. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and life continues asking for your attention, yet certain feelings remain exactly where they were first left behind. They do not always announce themselves through dramatic breakdowns or obvious moments of pain. More often, they settle quietly beneath awareness, becoming part of the invisible background against which every new experience is measured. You may believe you are reacting only to what stands in front of you today, while in reality, part of your response belongs to something that happened long ago. The past rarely returns wearing its own face. It usually disguises itself as the present, borrowing new situations to repeat emotions that never found resolution the first time. This hidden process explains why seemingly ordinary moments can produce unexpectedly powerful reactions. A simple misunderstanding feels strangely personal. A delayed reply creates anxiety that seems larger than the situation deserves. A passing criticism lingers in your thoughts for hours, while countless compliments disappear almost immediately. From the outside, these reactions appear unpredictable. From the inside, they feel completely justified. The conscious mind focuses on what just happened. The deeper mind quietly asks whether this feels familiar. If it does, old emotions quickly step forward, carrying with them expectations that were formed long before the current moment ever arrived. Without realizing it, you begin responding to accumulated history rather than immediate reality. Because this happens beneath awareness, many people spend years trying to solve the wrong problem. They believe peace depends entirely upon changing circumstances, avoiding certain conversations, or finding people who never disappoint them. Each solution offers temporary relief, but the same emotional patterns eventually return wearing different clothes. One difficult relationship ends, only for similar struggles to appear in another. One source of stress disappears, yet another quietly replaces it. This repetition often creates the illusion that life itself is working against you, when much of the struggle comes from carrying unresolved emotional patterns into every new environment. The external details continue changing, while the internal story remains remarkably consistent. Until that story is understood, the mind keeps searching for confirmation that it was correct all along. That search happens automatically, because the human mind naturally prefers familiarity over uncertainty. Even painful emotions can become strangely comfortable when they have been repeated often enough. They require no effort to recognize because they already know the path. Just as water gradually follows the same channels through the earth, repeated emotions slowly carve pathways that become easier to travel with each passing day. Eventually, disappointment arrives before evidence exists. Fear begins speaking before genuine danger appears. Self-doubt quietly introduces itself before new opportunities have even been explored. None of these reactions necessarily reflect reality. They reflect practice. The subconscious becomes remarkably efficient at repeating whatever it has rehearsed the longest, whether that rehearsal leads toward greater freedom or greater limitation. Sleep plays an important role in this process because the mind never truly stops organizing experience. While the body rests, the brain continues strengthening certain connections while allowing others to fade. Thoughts revisited throughout the day often receive another quiet rehearsal during the night, becoming slightly more familiar by morning. This is one reason emotional habits become so deeply rooted over time. They are not reinforced only during waking hours. They continue settling into memory while conscious awareness temporarily steps aside. By the time another sunrise arrives, yesterday's emotional patterns have already influenced the mood with which the new day begins. You wake believing your feelings belong entirely to the present, unaware that part of your emotional landscape was shaped long before your eyes ever opened. This understanding changes the purpose of evening reflection. Rather than treating the end of the day as a simple transition between work and rest, it becomes an opportunity to interrupt unconscious repetition before it quietly continues through the night. Reflection is not an attempt to erase difficult emotions or convince yourself that painful experiences never happened. It is the practice of meeting them with enough honesty that they no longer need to hide beneath awareness. Once something has been clearly seen, it begins losing the mysterious influence it once held. An emotion acknowledged calmly often becomes easier to carry than one constantly avoided. Avoidance may delay discomfort for a while, but it rarely removes it. More often, it simply gives unresolved feelings additional time to settle deeper into the foundations of your thinking. The Stoic path encourages this quiet honesty without asking you to become harsh toward yourself. There is no need to judge every uncomfortable feeling or demand immediate perfection. Growth rarely arrives through force. It develops through patient observation repeated consistently over time. You notice the emotional patterns asking for another rehearsal. You recognize where they first began. You allow yourself to see how they continue shaping present experiences without automatically surrendering to them. This simple act of awareness begins creating a small but meaningful distance between the emotion and the person experiencing it. That distance becomes the place where wiser choices quietly emerge. Over many evenings, something subtle begins changing. The emotions that once seemed permanent gradually lose their certainty. Reactions that once felt automatic become slightly slower, giving understanding enough time to enter before habit takes control. Tomorrow's mood is no longer determined entirely by yesterday's unresolved burdens, because those burdens are finally being examined instead of silently carried forward. Little by little, the mind learns that it does not have to preserve every painful story simply because it has repeated it for years. Some memories remain, but their emotional weight begins fading. Some disappointments stay part of your history, yet they stop becoming predictions about your future. The night no longer serves only as a place to recover from physical exhaustion. It quietly becomes the place where emotional burdens begin losing the power to decide who you will be when morning comes. Stoicism offers a different approach, one that feels surprisingly gentle despite its reputation for toughness. It does not ask you to suppress difficult emotions or pretend they never existed. It does not encourage building walls around the heart until nothing can reach you. Instead, it begins with something far quieter. It invites you to stop running. The sadness, frustration, disappointment and fear that seem so overwhelming during the day are not treated as enemies that must be defeated before peace can exist. They become experiences to observe carefully, with enough patience that they gradually reveal what has been hiding beneath them all along. This shift appears small at first, yet it changes the entire relationship you have with your own mind, because what is calmly understood no longer needs to keep demanding your attention. Many people spend years exhausting themselves in an invisible struggle against their own emotions. They push uncomfortable feelings away whenever they appear, convincing themselves that staying busy is the same as moving forward. They fill every empty moment with noise because silence feels dangerous. But avoidance has an interesting consequence. Whatever is repeatedly ignored rarely disappears. Instead, it quietly grows stronger beneath awareness, waiting for another opportunity to surface. The emotion itself is often less painful than the endless effort required to keep it hidden. That effort slowly drains your attention, your energy, and your ability to remain fully present. You may not notice the cost immediately because it is paid in small amounts each day, but over time the burden becomes part of your normal experience. You begin carrying emotional weight so consistently that you forget what it feels like to move without it. The Stoic path interrupts this cycle by replacing resistance with observation. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" it gently asks you to understand why it continues returning. That single change transforms the entire conversation. You stop treating emotions as problems that need immediate solutions and begin seeing them as signals pointing towards something that deserves honest attention. Anger may reveal an expectation that was never questioned. Anxiety may uncover a need for certainty that life was never capable of providing. Regret may expose a lesson still waiting to be accepted rather than endlessly replayed. Once these emotions are approached with curiosity instead of fear, they begin losing much of the urgency that once made them feel impossible to escape. Their power was never found solely in their existence. Much of it came from your constant effort to avoid looking directly at them. This becomes especially important as the day comes to an end. Night has a remarkable way of exposing whatever the mind has been trying to outrun. The distractions that filled every waking hour slowly fade into the background, leaving only your thoughts and the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. For someone who has spent the entire day avoiding difficult emotions, this silence can feel deeply uncomfortable. The mind immediately resumes conversations that were interrupted earlier. Old worries begin speaking again. Familiar fears quietly step forward. Yet for someone who has practiced careful observation throughout the day, the silence carries a different quality. Instead of becoming a place where unresolved emotions gain strength, it becomes a place where understanding continues deepening. The same quiet exists for both people. What changes is the relationship they have built with their own inner experience before the lights were ever turned off. One of the greatest misunderstandings about emotional discipline is the belief that calm people simply feel less. In reality, they often feel just as deeply as anyone else. The difference lies in what happens after the feeling appears. Rather than immediately reacting, resisting, or becoming consumed by it, they allow themselves a brief pause. That pause creates room for awareness to enter before habit takes control. It is within that small space that freedom quietly begins growing. Emotions are no longer treated as commands demanding immediate obedience. They become information. Useful, sometimes uncomfortable, but never absolute. Once this way of responding becomes familiar, the mind gradually stops fearing its own emotional landscape because it has learned that every feeling can be experienced without surrendering to it completely. This practice also changes the quality of sleep in ways that are easy to overlook. Physical rest may come from closing your eyes, but emotional rest depends upon what your mind continues carrying after the day has ended. A person who spends every evening fighting unwanted thoughts often falls asleep, exhausted long before feeling peaceful. The body may recover overnight, yet the mind wakes carrying the same unfinished burdens into another morning. Quiet observation creates a different ending to the day. Instead of feeding every worry another round of attention, you begin placing experiences into their proper perspective. Some deserve further reflection, others simply deserve permission to end. The subconscious no longer receives constant instructions to preserve every disappointment as something urgently important. It slowly learns that some experiences have already served their purpose and no longer need to occupy tomorrow. This does not happen in a single evening. The mind rarely changes through dramatic breakthroughs. It changes through repeated moments of patient awareness that slowly become familiar enough to replace older habits. Each time you choose observation over avoidance, another small adjustment takes place beneath awareness. Each time you sit quietly with an uncomfortable emotion instead of immediately escaping from it, you teach your mind that discomfort is not the same as danger. Confidence grows naturally from that realization because you begin trusting your ability to face your own inner world without becoming overwhelmed by it. Sleep becomes less about escaping the day and more about completing it with honesty. Eventually, something subtle begins changing long before you notice it consciously. Thoughts that once demanded endless repetition begin appearing less frequently. Emotional reactions soften because they are no longer supported by years of unconscious resistance. The silence before sleep starts feeling less like a confrontation and more like a conversation that no longer needs to be feared. The mind settles more easily because it has stopped carrying the impossible responsibility of avoiding itself. Peace does not arrive because life suddenly becomes easier. It arrives because the struggle against your own experience slowly comes to an end, leaving behind a quieter mind that no longer mistakes understanding for weakness or stillness for surrender. Many people confuse reflection with overthinking because, on the surface, both seem to involve revisiting the same experiences after the day has ended. They both happen in silence. They both ask you to look backward before moving forward. They both unfold while the world around you grows quiet, yet they lead to completely different destinations. One leaves the mind lighter than before. The other leaves it exhausted. One untangles confusion until understanding begins to emerge. The other ties every thought into tighter knots until even simple situations feel impossible to navigate. The difference is not found in how much you think, it is found in how you think. Reflection seeks truth. Overthinking seeks certainty. One accepts that not everything can be controlled. The other refuses to stop searching until every possible outcome has been predicted, every mistake corrected, and every uncomfortable feeling explained away. That search never truly ends because the mind was never designed to eliminate all uncertainty. The harder it tries, the more uncertainty it discovers waiting around the next corner. This is why so many evenings quietly become battles that no one else can see. The lights go out, the room becomes still, and the mind immediately begins replaying the same conversations that seemed finished hours ago. A sentence spoken carelessly is examined from every possible angle. An awkward moment is replayed with different endings. A decision made earlier in the day suddenly feels questionable. At first, this seems responsible. It feels as though you are learning from experience or preparing yourself for tomorrow. But after a while, nothing new is being discovered. The same thoughts simply circle back to where they started. There is no deeper understanding, only deeper exhaustion. The mind mistakes repetition for progress because movement often feels productive, even when it leads nowhere. Hours can disappear inside these familiar loops without producing a single meaningful insight. By morning, the emotional weight has increased, yet the original problem remains exactly where it was the night before. Reflection moves differently. It is slower, calmer, and remarkably free from urgency. It does not demand immediate answers because it understands that clarity rarely appears under pressure. Instead of asking how every uncomfortable feeling can be eliminated, it quietly asks what the experience is trying to reveal. That small shift changes everything. A difficult conversation stops being evidence that you failed and becomes an opportunity to understand why certain words affected you so deeply. A disappointment becomes more than proof that life is unfair. It becomes an invitation to examine the expectations that made the disappointment feel so overwhelming in the first place. Reflection is less concerned with defending the ego than understanding the mind. It does not rush toward conclusions because it recognizes that lasting wisdom usually arrives after judgment has become quiet enough to listen. Overthinking, on the other hand, rarely listens. It argues. It searches endlessly for explanations that provide complete emotional safety, even though life has never offered such guarantees. One thought quickly gives birth to another, and before long the original issue has become almost impossible to recognize beneath the growing pile of imagined possibilities. A small uncertainty turns into a future catastrophe. A simple misunderstanding becomes evidence of permanent failure. The imagination quietly expands every fear until it feels larger than reality itself. This happens because overthinking feeds on unanswered questions. Instead of accepting that some things require patience, it demands immediate certainty from situations that cannot possibly provide it. The result is a restless mind that spends more time predicting tomorrow than living today. Ironically, the more energy it spends trying to prevent suffering, the more suffering it quietly creates. The Stoic approach gently interrupts this pattern by bringing attention back to what is actually present instead of what might happen next. Rather than following every anxious thought wherever it chooses to lead, you begin asking whether that thought deserves your attention at all. Many do not. Some are simply echoes of earlier fears returning out of habit rather than necessity. Others belong to problems that no longer exist except inside memory. This realization does not require you to force thoughts away or pretend they never appeared. It simply reminds you that noticing a thought is different from believing it. The mind is capable of producing countless stories throughout a single evening. Awareness quietly decides which stories deserve to continue and which ones can end without another rehearsal. That quiet decision gradually changes the emotional atmosphere of the night. Sleep itself begins feeling different once this distinction becomes familiar. Instead of carrying every unfinished thought into bed as though it were urgently important, you slowly learn to separate genuine reflection from endless mental repetition. Some experiences deserve careful attention because they contain lessons that strengthen character. Others deserve nothing more than acknowledgement before being released. This process is surprisingly gentle. There is no dramatic struggle against the mind, no attempt to silence every thought. You simply stop giving equal importance to everything that passes through your awareness. The mind begins discovering that peace is not created by thinking more. It often appears when unnecessary thinking quietly comes to an end. This shift also changes the relationship you have with yourself. Overthinking often speaks with the voice of constant criticism, convincing you that relentless analysis is proof of responsibility. Reflection speaks differently. It remains honest without becoming cruel. It allows mistakes to remain visible without turning them into permanent identities. That balance creates something many people spend years searching for without realizing it. Self-understanding replaces self-condemnation. Curiosity replaces constant judgment. You become willing to learn from experience instead of endlessly punishing yourself for having one. That willingness softens the emotional tension carried throughout the day and prevents it from quietly following you into the night. Over time, the evenings become less crowded. The same silence remains, but it no longer feels occupied by endless arguments inside your own mind. Thoughts still arrive because that is what minds naturally do. The difference is that they no longer control the entire conversation. Reflection gently gathers what deserves to remain while allowing the rest to pass without resistance. Night after night, that simple habit creates a quieter inner world. Sleep becomes less about escaping mental noise and more about resting within a mind that has finally learned the difference between searching for clarity and becoming lost inside its own endless questions. Before sleep, the mind naturally becomes quieter. The conversations of the day begin fading into the background. The demands that filled every hour slowly lose their urgency. The constant movement that once pulled your attention in countless directions finally begins to settle. Many people mistake this quietness for emptiness, believing nothing important is happening simply because the world around them has become still. In reality, some of the most significant moments of the day are only just beginning. When external noise disappears, the inner world becomes easier to hear. Thoughts that spent the entire day waiting patiently beneath deadlines, conversations, and responsibilities finally have enough space to emerge. Some arrive gently, asking only to be acknowledged. Others return with surprising intensity, carrying emotions that seemed forgotten only hours before. The silence does not create these experiences. It simply reveals what has been present all along. This is why the final moments before sleep deserve more attention than they usually receive. Throughout the day, the mind constantly adapts to whatever demands immediate focus. There is always another message to answer, another task to complete, another decision to make. Even moments of rest are often filled with entertainment designed to keep attention occupied. Rarely does the mind experience uninterrupted stillness. Yet the evening quietly removes those layers one by one until only awareness remains. Without constant stimulation directing your attention outward, your thoughts naturally begin turning inward. This transition can feel unfamiliar because modern life rarely encourages people to sit comfortably with themselves. Instead, many instinctively reach for another distraction, not because they truly need it, but because silence has become something they no longer know how to trust. The remarkable thing about silence is that it refuses to compete for your attention. It waits. It asks for nothing. It simply creates enough space for the mind to reveal what has already been shaping your inner life without permission. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. A forgotten disappointment quietly returns. An unfinished conversation begins replaying itself. A worry about tomorrow gently knocks at the door of your attention. It is tempting to believe these thoughts arrived because the room became quiet, but they have been traveling beside you all day. They simply lacked an opportunity to speak clearly, while louder concerns occupied the surface of your awareness. The quieter the environment becomes, the easier it is to notice what has been quietly influencing your emotions beneath everything else. This moment carries an unusual kind of power because habits become especially visible when there is nothing left to distract from them. During busy hours, emotional patterns often hide behind circumstances. You assume irritation comes from traffic, exhaustion comes from work, or anxiety comes from tomorrow's responsibilities. As the day slows, those explanations begin losing some of their certainty. You start recognizing that many reactions have become familiar long before today's events ever occurred. Certain thoughts appear almost automatically. Particular fears seem to know exactly when to return. Old judgments slip into awareness without invitation. None of this happens because the night is working against you. It happens because the mind naturally returns to whatever it has practiced most consistently. Quietness does not invent habits, it exposes them. That realization may feel unsettling at first, but it is also deeply encouraging. A habit revealed is no longer invisible. Once you begin noticing where your attention naturally travels, you gain the opportunity to gently guide it somewhere new. This is why the evening becomes more than a simple ending to the day. It becomes a meeting place between unconscious repetition and conscious choice. You begin recognizing the familiar pathways your mind has been following for weeks, months, or even years. Instead of automatically walking those same roads again, you pause long enough to ask whether they still deserve your attention. This is not a struggle against your own thoughts. It is an invitation to observe them without immediately becoming part of every story they tell. Slowly, another possibility begins appearing. The same quietness that once strengthened anxious habits now starts dissolving them. This change rarely happens through dramatic effort. It develops because awareness interrupts repetition. A thought appears, but instead of chasing it through endless conclusions, you simply notice it. An uncomfortable emotion rises, but instead of treating it as an emergency, you allow it to exist without immediately feeding it another hour of attention. Something remarkable happens in these small moments. Habits depend upon unconscious repetition. Once awareness enters the process, repetition becomes less automatic. The emotional pathways that once felt impossible to escape begin losing some of their certainty because they are no longer receiving constant reinforcement. This gentle shift changes the quality of the entire night. Rather than becoming a place where worries gather strength before tomorrow begins, the evening slowly becomes a place where unnecessary burdens are quietly set down. You stop expecting the mind to become completely empty because that was never its purpose. Thoughts will continue arriving, memories will continue appearing, emotions will continue moving through your awareness. The difference is that they no longer dictate the direction of the entire evening. Some remain briefly before passing naturally. Others reveal something worth understanding before fading on their own. The silence itself remains unchanged, but your relationship with it becomes entirely different. Instead of fearing what might surface, you begin trusting that whatever appears can be observed with patience rather than resisted with urgency. Night after night, this simple practice quietly reshapes the inner landscape. The habits that once tightened their grip through constant repetition begin weakening because they are no longer being rehearsed without awareness. In their place, something steadier begins taking root. Patience grows where impatience once rushed ahead. Understanding gradually replaces automatic judgment. The mind learns that stillness is not something to escape, but something to enter willingly. Sleep becomes more than physical rest because the final moments before it are no longer filled with unconscious struggle. They become an opportunity to leave behind what no longer deserves another tomorrow. By the time morning arrives, the external world may remain exactly the same, yet something within has shifted ever so slightly. Those small shifts, repeated across countless quiet evenings, become the foundation upon which a calmer, clearer, and more deliberate life is slowly built. Every repeated emotional pattern began as a single experience. No one enters the world already convinced they are not enough. No child is born expecting rejection, preparing for disappointment, or assuming every mistake defines their worth. Those conclusions are learned gradually, often so quietly that the learning itself goes unnoticed. A painful conversation leaves an impression. A moment of embarrassment lingers longer than expected. Trust is broken. Effort goes unseen. One difficult experience rarely changes an entire life, but the meaning attached to it can. When the same interpretation is repeated often enough, it slowly becomes less like a memory and more like a belief. Over time, that belief begins influencing thoughts, emotions, and decisions long after the original event has faded into the background. The experience ends, but the story continues because the mind keeps telling it. That is how emotional patterns quietly take root. They are rarely created in a single dramatic moment. More often they are built through small conclusions, repeated so consistently that they eventually feel inseparable from who you are. This is why familiar emotions can feel strangely convincing, even when they no longer reflect reality. Fear appears before the situation has revealed whether it deserves fear. Shame arrives before any real judgment has been made. Disappointment begins preparing itself before events have fully unfolded. These emotions seem automatic because they have traveled the same path so many times that the mind no longer pauses to ask whether the journey is still necessary. Familiarity creates efficiency. The brain prefers what it already knows because familiar pathways require less energy than creating new ones. Unfortunately, the mind makes very little distinction between habits that protect you and habits that quietly limit you. It simply strengthens whatever receives repeated attention. If a particular emotional response has been practiced for years, it begins appearing almost instantly, often before conscious thought has a chance to participate. What feels like instinct is frequently repetition wearing a different name. This realization can feel unsettling because it challenges the comforting belief that personality is fixed. It is easier to assume this is just who I am than to question patterns that have existed for so long they seem permanent. Yet many of the qualities people describe as personality are simply emotional habits that have become deeply familiar. The person who expects rejection may not have been born pessimistic. They may have learned to protect themselves by expecting disappointment before it could surprise them. The person who constantly seeks approval may have spent years believing acceptance had to be earned rather than received. The person who struggles to trust may have learned that lesson honestly through painful experiences. None of these patterns appear without reason. They often begin as intelligent responses to difficult circumstances. The problem is that what once protected you can continue controlling you long after the original danger has disappeared. The mind rarely notices when protection quietly becomes limitation. A habit formed during one chapter of life can continue directing behavior in completely different circumstances. Someone who learned to remain silent in order to avoid conflict may continue withholding honest thoughts even when surrounded by people who genuinely want to understand them. Someone who became emotionally guarded after disappointment may continue keeping meaningful relationships at a distance, despite no longer facing the same risks. The pattern survives because it succeeded once before. The subconscious remembers the relief it provided and repeats it automatically, even when the situation has completely changed. This is not weakness, it is simply the mind doing what it was designed to do. It preserves what once appeared useful. Awareness becomes necessary because the mind cannot distinguish between an outdated strategy and a timeless truth without your participation. That is where genuine change quietly begins. Before replacing an emotional pattern, you first recognize that it has a history. It did not appear out of nowhere. It developed through repetition, experience, and interpretation. Realizing this removes some of the shame people often carry about their struggles. Instead of viewing yourself as broken, you begin seeing yourself as someone who learned certain ways of responding under particular conditions. Learning can always be questioned. Habits can always be observed. Patterns can always be interrupted. This perspective replaces hopelessness with responsibility, not the heavy responsibility of blaming yourself for everything that happened, but the quieter responsibility of deciding what deserves to continue shaping your future. The past may explain your emotional habits, but it does not have to keep writing tomorrow's responses. This patient way of looking inward reflects a discipline that is often misunderstood. Many assume inner strength requires forcing unwanted emotions to disappear through sheer determination. In reality, forcing usually strengthens resistance rather than creating freedom. Lasting change begins with honest observation. You notice where fear consistently appears. You recognize which situations awaken familiar shame. You become curious about the disappointments that continue echoing years after they first occurred. Gradually, these emotional patterns stop feeling mysterious because you begin understanding the path they followed to arrive where they are today. Once the path becomes visible, it also becomes possible to choose another direction. Awareness quietly interrupts automatic repetition. creating space for something different to emerge. This process unfolds slowly because deeply rooted habits rarely disappear overnight. They loosen through countless ordinary moments rather than dramatic breakthroughs. One evening you respond with slightly more patience than before. Another day you notice fear without immediately believing everything it says. A familiar disappointment arises, yet this time it does not define the entire day. These changes may appear insignificant in isolation, but together they begin reshaping the emotional landscape that once felt permanent. The old pattern still appears occasionally, but its certainty begins fading. It no longer arrives as an unquestioned authority. It becomes one voice among many rather than the only story available. Eventually, a quiet realization begins taking hold. Familiarity was never proof that something belonged to you forever. An emotion repeated for years can still be released. A belief carried since childhood can still be questioned. A pattern followed through countless seasons of life can still come to an end. The mind changes gradually because it learns gradually. Just as repeated experiences once strengthened habits that no longer serve you, repeated moments of awareness begin building something steadier in their place. The same patience that allowed old emotional patterns to develop becomes the patience that gently dissolves them. Night after night, reflection after reflection, you discover that your history may explain the roads you have traveled, but it does not have the authority to decide where the next road must lead. The subconscious has a remarkably simple way of learning. It does not pause to examine every thought with careful logic before deciding whether it deserves a permanent place in your mind. It does not patiently separate useful beliefs from destructive ones. Instead, it pays close attention to repetition. Whatever receives your focus again and again gradually becomes familiar, and whatever becomes familiar begins feeling true, regardless of whether it actually is. This happens quietly, without permission, because the subconscious was never designed to act as a philosopher, carefully evaluating every conclusion. It behaves more like a faithful recorder, preserving what it experiences most often and preparing to use it again whenever similar situations appear. That is why the thoughts that accompany you into the evening carry far more influence than they seem to in the moment. They are not simply passing through your awareness, they are teaching your mind what to expect from life tomorrow. Consider how naturally this process unfolds. A single thought appears after a difficult conversation. Perhaps you tell yourself you should have spoken differently or that someone must think less of you now. On its own, that thought has very little power. But if it returns the following morning, reappears throughout the afternoon, and quietly settles beside you before sleep, it begins becoming something more than a passing reaction. It starts becoming familiar. Familiarity slowly transforms possibility into expectation. Before long, you stop questioning the thought because it has accompanied you so consistently that it feels like an ordinary part of your inner voice. The subconscious accepts this repetition without demanding proof. It simply notices where attention keeps returning and quietly prepares to continue the pattern. This explains why people often struggle to understand where certain beliefs about themselves originated. They cannot remember making a conscious decision to feel inadequate or anxious or unworthy. In truth, very few people ever choose those conclusions deliberately. They simply spend enough time rehearsing particular thoughts that the subconscious gradually adopts them as reliable patterns. Once that happens, the mind begins filtering new experiences through those existing expectations. Compliments become easy to dismiss because they conflict with familiar beliefs. Criticism feels deeply convincing because it agrees with what has already been practiced internally. Reality itself begins bending around the stories repeated most often. The world has not necessarily changed. The lens through which it is interpreted quietly has. Nighttime gives these patterns unusual influence because the mind becomes less occupied with immediate demands. During the day, attention constantly shifts between conversations, work, responsibilities, and countless small decisions. Those interruptions naturally limit how long one thought can remain at the center of awareness. Evening removes many of those interruptions. The same idea that briefly appeared during breakfast now has room to linger. It grows stronger through repetition, not because it contains greater wisdom, but because it receives uninterrupted attention. This is why the emotional atmosphere surrounding your final waking moments matters so much. The subconscious does not distinguish between thoughts chosen intentionally and thoughts entertained accidentally. It simply notices which ones remain present as consciousness slowly begins giving way to sleep. Many people unknowingly reinforce the very emotional patterns they wish would disappear. They spend the final minutes of the evening reviewing everything that went wrong, replaying uncomfortable conversations, anticipating tomorrow's problems, or criticizing themselves for mistakes that cannot be changed. None of this feels like training. It feels like thinking. Yet from the subconscious perspective, repetition is instruction. Each replay quietly communicates that this material deserves preservation. The mind responds accordingly. It strengthens the emotional pathways connected to those thoughts, making them slightly easier to access the following day. Then, the cycle repeats. Familiar thoughts become increasingly automatic until they appear without invitation. What began as an occasional concern slowly becomes part of the emotional background against which daily life unfolds. The encouraging part is that this process works in both directions. Just as repeated worry gradually shapes expectation, repeated calm begins doing the same. When you spend time each evening returning your attention to steadier, more balanced ways of seeing your experiences, the subconscious quietly begins learning those patterns as well. This does not require pretending difficult emotions never existed. It simply means refusing to rehearse them endlessly after they have already taught what they needed to teach. Instead of feeding fear another hour of attention, you begin practicing acceptance. Instead of repeating harsh judgments about yourself, you begin noticing your experiences with greater honesty and less condemnation. At first, these new patterns may feel unfamiliar because they have not yet received enough repetition to become natural. That discomfort is temporary. Familiarity always follows consistent practice. This is why patience becomes such an important part of inner change. People often expect immediate transformation after one evening of reflection or one day of disciplined thinking. The subconscious rarely works that way. It changes through accumulation. Just as years of repeated emotional habits were not built overnight, healthier patterns also require time before they become automatic. Each quiet evening contributes another small lesson. Each moment spent observing rather than reacting becomes another reminder that attention is a choice. Eventually, those small moments gather enough momentum that the mind begins following them without constant effort. Peace stops feeling like something that must be forced because it has slowly become familiar. As this understanding deepens, the final moments before sleep take on an entirely different meaning. They are no longer empty minutes waiting for unconsciousness to arrive. They become one of the most important opportunities of the day to gently influence the direction your inner life will continue taking. Whatever receives your attention during those quiet moments quietly echoes long after your eyes have closed. The subconscious listens carefully, not because it understands every word, but because it faithfully remembers what you repeatedly place before it. Night after night, those repetitions become habits. Habits become expectations. Expectations shape perception. And before long, the life you experience each morning begins reflecting the thoughts you quietly rehearsed while the rest of the world was asleep. This raises an uncomfortable question, one that many people spend years avoiding without even realizing it. If the same emotional wounds return every evening, If the same disappointments continue asking for your attention after the day has ended, then something more than memory is taking place. The mind is not simply remembering the past, it is rehearsing it. Each repetition becomes another quiet lesson, another reminder offered to the subconscious about who you believe you are and what you should expect from the world. Night after night, these rehearsals continue without applause or announcement. They happen in silence, beneath conscious awareness, where identity is shaped far more than most people realize. The greatest influence on tomorrow is often not what happens tomorrow at all. It is what you repeatedly tell yourself before today has fully come to an end. This process feels so natural that it rarely attracts suspicion. You lie awake thinking about an argument that happened years ago, a mistake you wish you could erase, or an opportunity that slipped away. At first, it seems harmless. After all, everyone reflects from time to time, but reflection quietly becomes reinforcement when the same emotional story is repeated without gaining any new understanding. The event itself no longer changes. Only the emotional pathway grows stronger. Each rehearsal makes it easier for the mind to travel the same familiar road again tomorrow. Eventually, you stop choosing that path consciously because it has become the default direction your attention naturally follows whenever life becomes quiet. The story is no longer something you occasionally remember. It becomes part of the lens through which you interpret yourself. This explains why certain emotional patterns become so difficult to break. They are no longer supported only by memory. They are supported by identity. Somewhere along the way, disappointment stops being something that happened and quietly becomes evidence for who you believe yourself to be. Fear stops functioning as a temporary response and begins presenting itself as wisdom. Shame no longer appears as an emotion passing through awareness, but as proof that something is permanently wrong with you. Once emotions become attached to identity, they naturally resist change, because changing them begins feeling like changing yourself. The mind protects familiar identities even when those identities continue producing unnecessary suffering. Familiarity creates safety, even if that safety comes at the cost of peace. The strange part is that this transformation rarely happens through dramatic events alone. More often, it develops through countless ordinary evenings that seem completely unremarkable. You repeat the same judgments before sleep. You revisit the same disappointments. You quietly assume tomorrow will feel much like yesterday because yesterday feels so familiar. Each repetition appears insignificant on its own, almost too small to matter. Yet identity is rarely built through extraordinary moments. It is built through ordinary thoughts, repeated so consistently that they become automatic. Little by little, the subconscious stops asking whether these stories are accurate. It simply begins organizing your expectations around them. Tomorrow starts looking remarkably similar to yesterday because the mind has already decided which emotional patterns deserve another performance. This realization is not meant to create discouragement. In fact, it offers one of the most hopeful insights available. If repeated thoughts helped shape the person you have become, then repeated awareness can help shape the person you are still becoming. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Identity is far less rigid than it often appears. Beneath every emotional habit lies a pattern strengthened through repetition. Anything strengthened through repetition can gradually weaken when that repetition changes. The process requires patience because deeply familiar stories rarely disappear after one evening of reflection. But each time you choose not to rehearse an old wound in quite the same way, something subtle begins shifting. The subconscious notices new patterns just as faithfully as it once learned the old ones. This is why the moments before sleep deserve so much respect. During those quiet minutes, you are not merely ending another day. You are quietly introducing your mind to the version of yourself you intend to strengthen. If your attention repeatedly settles on resentment, your emotional world slowly organizes itself around resentment. If your attention continually returns to failure, your expectations begin reflecting failure before new experiences have even unfolded. But when you consistently return to acceptance, honesty, patience, and perspective, those qualities also begin settling into the deeper layers of the mind. They may feel unfamiliar at first because they have not yet accumulated years of repetition. That unfamiliarity is not evidence that they are unnatural. It is simply evidence that they are new. Gradually, the evening becomes less about reviewing everything that went wrong and more about noticing what deserves to continue into tomorrow. Some experiences still require reflection because they contain genuine lessons. Others ask only to be released. The wisdom lies in recognizing the difference. Without that discernment, every emotional wound demands equal attention, and the mind grows crowded with burdens that no longer serve any meaningful purpose. With that discernment, the inner world begins feeling lighter, because unnecessary repetition quietly loses its place. You stop feeding old stories simply because they have become familiar. Instead, you begin choosing which stories deserve another chapter, and which ones have already reached their natural conclusion. Over time, this quiet discipline changes something remarkably deep. The emotional wounds that once seemed permanent no longer define every evening. They still exist as part of your history, but they stop functioning as architects of your future. The subconscious gradually learns that your identity is larger than your disappointments, stronger than your fears, and far more flexible than old habits once suggested. Morning arrives carrying a different emotional atmosphere because the night before was no longer spent reinforcing the same familiar pain. Instead of strengthening old versions of yourself through unconscious repetition, you begin strengthening a quieter, steadier way of being that grows almost unnoticed, one evening at a time. Long before anyone else recognizes the change, you begin feeling it within yourself. The same silence remains, but it is no longer occupied by the constant echo of old wounds. It becomes the place where a different version of you is patiently, quietly, and deliberately being built. The Stoics understood that healing begins long before circumstances improve. It begins the moment you become willing to observe your own mind with honesty instead of immediately believing everything it tells you. This sounds simple, yet it may be one of the most difficult disciplines a person can practice. The mind speaks constantly. From the moment you wake until the moment you fall asleep, an endless stream of thoughts quietly interprets every experience. Some of those thoughts encourage patience. Others quietly fuel fear, resentment, or self-doubt. Most pass by so quickly that they are accepted without question. They become the invisible narrator of your life, explaining what every event means and what each experience supposedly says about you. Because that voice has always been present, it rarely feels separate from who you are. It simply feels like reality. But reality and interpretation are not always the same thing, and recognizing that difference becomes the beginning of genuine inner change. Throughout the day, these conversations continue beneath everything you do. You may be speaking with coworkers, spending time with family, answering messages, or completing ordinary tasks. Yet another dialogue quietly unfolds beneath every action. It comments on your performance. It predicts outcomes before they arrive. It judges your mistakes and compares your progress to invisible standards that were never consciously chosen. Most people become so accustomed to this inner commentary that they stop hearing it altogether. They notice only the emotions that follow. Anxiety appears without recognizing the thoughts that created it. Discouragement settles in without seeing the quiet judgments that prepared the way. Frustration feels automatic because the conversation leading toward it happened so quickly that awareness never caught up. The emotion becomes obvious. The thinking beneath it remains hidden. Learning to notice these conversations does not require constant analysis or endless self-examination. In fact, forcing awareness usually creates another layer of unnecessary tension. Instead, it begins with quiet observation. You simply become interested in where your mind naturally goes when nothing demands immediate attention. During a peaceful walk, while waiting in line, or during the final minutes before sleep, the inner voice gradually becomes easier to hear. It reveals what it values, what it fears, and what it continues protecting long after protection is no longer needed. Some thoughts disappear almost as quickly as they arrive. Others return so consistently that they deserve closer attention. Those repeated themes often reveal the beliefs quietly shaping your entire emotional world. At first, this observation may feel uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that your thoughts are automatically accurate. You begin recognizing how often the mind predicts outcomes that never happen. You notice how quickly it assumes the worst without gathering enough evidence. You hear the familiar criticism that appears after even small mistakes, speaking as though perfection were the only acceptable standard. None of this realization is meant to create shame. Quite the opposite. Awareness softens self-judgment because it creates distance between the observer and the thought itself. Instead of saying, "This is who I am," you quietly begin saying, "This is what my mind is saying right now." That subtle shift changes everything. Thoughts remain present, but they no longer possess the same unquestioned authority they once held. The evenings become especially meaningful because the inner dialogue grows easier to notice once external noise begins fading. The world becomes quieter, and the mind naturally steps forward. This is not the time to fear what you hear. It is the time to listen with patience. Some conversations deserve to continue because they lead toward understanding. Others have been repeating for years without offering anything new. They survive only because they have never been questioned. Once awareness gently shines upon them, they begin losing the certainty that repetition once provided. A familiar fear starts looking less like destiny and more like habit. A harsh judgment begins sounding more like an old echo than an undeniable truth. The voice remains, but its influence quietly weakens because it is finally being seen instead of unconsciously followed. This patient practice slowly transforms the relationship you have with yourself. Rather than constantly reacting to every passing thought, you begin responding with greater steadiness. Silence no longer feels threatening because it becomes a place where understanding quietly grows. The conversations inside your mind continue, but they no longer unfold without your participation. You become an active witness instead of an unconscious listener. Over time, this changes far more than your evenings. It changes the emotional atmosphere you carry into each new morning. Decisions become less driven by old assumptions. Reactions become less automatic. The mind gradually learns that awareness itself is deeply healing because it interrupts the habits that once shaped life without permission. Before circumstances ever begin changing, the person experiencing those circumstances has already started seeing them through clearer eyes, and that quiet shift becomes the foundation upon which every lasting transformation is built. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of the mind. The more desperately you try not to think about something, the more deeply your attention becomes attached to it. Resistance keeps the memory alive because resistance requires constant awareness of what you are trying to avoid. You cannot continually push something away without continuing to look in its direction. It is like attempting to hold a ball beneath the surface of water. For a while, effort keeps it hidden, but that effort never truly ends. The moment your attention weakens, it rises again. Emotional memories often behave the same way. They remain beneath awareness only as long as enough energy is spent forcing them down. Eventually, exhaustion arrives. The memory surfaces once more, and it feels as though nothing has changed despite all the effort invested in escaping it. Patience offers another path entirely. Instead of immediately resisting what appears, you allow yourself to notice it without rushing to solve it. A memory arrives, you acknowledge it, you recognize the emotion attached to it. Then, rather than becoming trapped inside the old story, you simply remain present long enough to see it clearly. This sounds almost too simple, yet it changes something fundamental. The memory no longer controls the entire experience because it is no longer unfolding without awareness. You become the observer instead of the prisoner. The event remains part of your history, but it stops becoming the only reality available in the present moment. That quiet distance creates room for understanding to enter where automatic reaction once lived. Many painful memories continue influencing life because they were never fully experienced when they first occurred. Perhaps there was no time to process them. Perhaps survival required moving forward before understanding could catch up. Responsibilities continued. Other people depended upon you. Life demanded action before reflection became possible. There is nothing unusual about that. The mind often postpones difficult emotions until a quieter season arrives. The problem begins when postponed emotions are mistaken for resolved emotions. Time alone cannot finish work that awareness never began. The memory grows older, but the emotional response remains remarkably young, waiting patiently beneath the surface until another familiar moment quietly opens the same door. This is why the evening can become such an important space for healing. During the day, your attention belongs to countless external demands. At night, those demands gradually lose their urgency, allowing deeper experiences to become visible again. It is tempting to interpret this as proof that the night creates unnecessary suffering, but something else is happening. The silence simply provides enough room for unfinished experiences to finally step into the light. Instead of meeting them with frustration, you begin meeting them with curiosity. You stop asking how quickly they can disappear and begin wondering what they have been trying to tell you all along. Often the answer has very little to do with the event itself. The memory points toward an old belief, an old fear, or an old conclusion that quietly shaped everything that followed. As this way of looking inward becomes familiar, something subtle begins changing. The emotional intensity surrounding certain memories starts fading, not because you force them to disappear, but because you finally stop treating them like enemies. Fear thrives when it believes it cannot be faced. Shame grows stronger when it remains hidden. Regret repeats itself when it never receives honest attention. Patient observation slowly interrupts all three. The memory still exists, but it loses the urgency that once made it feel overwhelming. You realize that remembering something painful is not the same as reliving it. The event belongs to the past, even if the mind occasionally visits it. That distinction creates an unexpected sense of freedom because you begin recognizing that awareness allows you to remain in the present while looking at the past. As this habit develops, something almost invisible begins changing inside you. The emotions themselves do not suddenly disappear, nor do difficult moments stop arriving without warning. Life continues presenting disappointment, uncertainty, criticism, and loss, just as it always has. The difference emerges somewhere much quieter than the events themselves. It appears in the brief moment between what happens and how you respond. At first, that space feels so small it is almost impossible to notice. A comment hurts, and before you realize it, your mood has already changed. A plan falls apart, and frustration immediately takes over. A memory returns, and suddenly the entire evening belongs to the past instead of the present. But patient awareness slowly changes this rhythm. The reaction that once felt instantaneous begins arriving a little more slowly. You notice the emotion before becoming completely absorbed by it. That simple shift may seem insignificant, yet it quietly changes the direction of your entire inner life. Many people believe emotional strength means never feeling deeply. They admire those who appear untouched by disappointment or criticism, assuming that calm comes from emotional distance. In reality, lasting steadiness is built very differently. It does not come from feeling less. It comes from becoming less controlled by whatever you feel in the moment. An emotion still rises naturally because emotions are part of being human. Sadness still visits, anger still appears, fear still whispers its familiar warnings. The difference is that these emotions stop arriving with absolute authority. Instead of immediately accepting every feeling as a command that demands action, you begin seeing it as one part of your experience rather than the whole of it. That distinction creates freedom because awareness quietly enters before habit has the opportunity to take control. This process often surprises people because it develops so gradually. There is rarely a dramatic morning when you wake up completely transformed. More often, the first signs are almost too small to notice. Someone says something that would normally linger in your thoughts for hours, yet this time it fades after a few minutes. An inconvenience appears, and although irritation rises, it no longer spreads into every part of the day. A familiar worry returns before sleep, but instead of pulling you into another endless cycle of mental repetition, it quietly passes without demanding complete attention. As Seneca wrote, the greatest remedy for anger is delay. The same quiet pause begins changing more than anger. It gradually changes the way you meet every emotion. These moments seem ordinary while they are happening. Only later do you realize that your relationship with your own emotions has already begun changing. The events remained familiar. Your participation in them became different. This growing space between feeling and reaction allows something important to happen. Perspective finally has enough room to speak. When emotional habits move too quickly, there is little opportunity to recognize whether they actually fit the present situation. Old fears quietly borrow new faces. Yesterday's disappointments disguise themselves as today's expectations. The mind follows familiar pathways because they have been rehearsed countless times before. But when awareness gently slows the process, another possibility becomes visible. You begin asking whether the current moment truly deserves the emotional story your mind is preparing to repeat. Often the answer is quieter than expected. The present situation is not as threatening as old habits first suggested. Much of the urgency belonged to memory rather than reality. Recognizing that difference becomes one of the most valuable forms of inner discipline because it prevents yesterday from constantly rewriting today. This quiet confidence grows because your attention gradually becomes less reactive. You stop believing that every uncomfortable feeling requires immediate action. Some emotions simply need acknowledgement. Others deserve thoughtful reflection. A few reveal important lessons. Many simply arrive because the mind has become accustomed to repeating them. Learning to distinguish between these different experiences prevents unnecessary suffering from multiplying. Without awareness, every emotional impulse feels equally urgent. With awareness, the mind becomes more discerning. It recognizes that intensity does not always indicate importance. A powerful feeling can still be temporary. A quiet realization can still change everything. This understanding softens the emotional pressure carried throughout the day because you no longer treat every passing reaction as though it were a permanent truth. The wider this inner space becomes, the more deliberate your choices begin feeling. Conversations become calmer because immediate defensiveness no longer speaks first. Difficult situations become easier to navigate because fear no longer decides every response before reason has an opportunity to contribute. Even moments of uncertainty begin losing some of their emotional weight because you realize uncertainty itself is not the true source of suffering. Much of the struggle came from the automatic stories your mind attached to uncertainty long before anything had actually happened. Once those stories become visible, they lose much of their ability to direct your behavior without permission. Over time, this quiet slowing changes far more than isolated emotional reactions. It changes the atmosphere in which your entire life unfolds. Days begin with greater steadiness because the previous evening was not spent strengthening unnecessary fears. Sleep becomes deeper because the mind no longer feels responsible for solving every unanswered question before morning arrives. Relationships improve because patience quietly replaces impulse. Most importantly, you begin trusting yourself in a way that once seemed impossible, not because life has become predictable, but because you have discovered that your peace no longer depends entirely upon circumstances unfolding according to plan. Between every feeling and every response now exists a little more room than before. That room becomes the place where wisdom quietly grows, where old habits slowly lose their certainty, and where the person you are becoming begins choosing each day with greater intention than the person you used to be. That small pause becomes one of the greatest strengths you can ever develop, though it rarely looks impressive from the outside. No one applauds it. No one notices it happening. There are no dramatic signs announcing that something important has just taken place. A conversation continues. Someone speaks carelessly. An unexpected problem appears. A familiar memory rises to the surface. From the outside, everything looks exactly the same. Inside, however, something entirely different begins unfolding. Instead of reacting immediately, you remain present just long enough for awareness to arrive before emotion takes complete control. The feeling still exists. The situation has not changed, but for the first time, the emotion is no longer the only voice participating in the moment. That brief space creates possibilities that simply do not exist when every reaction happens automatically. It becomes the place where better decisions quietly begin. That small pause quietly interrupts this pattern. It creates enough distance for another perspective to enter before old emotional habits begin repeating themselves. Instead of instantly defending yourself, you notice the urge to defend. Instead of immediately assuming the worst, you recognize the familiar tendency to expect disappointment. Instead of allowing one uncomfortable moment to define the entire day, you acknowledge the feeling without giving it permission to decide everything that follows. This is not emotional suppression. Nothing is being forced away. The emotion remains visible. The difference is that awareness now stands beside it, offering another way of seeing the situation before habit quietly takes over. That single moment of observation often changes far more than people expect, because it prevents emotions from becoming the unquestioned authors of every decision. This is why wisdom rarely announces itself through dramatic breakthroughs. More often it appears through ordinary pauses that seem almost too small to matter. Someone misunderstands your intentions, and instead of immediately correcting them with frustration, you listen a little longer. A delay disrupts carefully made plans, and instead of convincing yourself the entire day is ruined, you breathe before deciding what the situation actually requires. A familiar memory returns before sleep, but instead of falling into another endless cycle of regret, you simply acknowledge its presence without allowing it to rewrite the present. None of these moments appear extraordinary in isolation. Together, they gradually reshape the way you move through life. Calm is not built through one perfect decision. It is built through countless pauses that quietly prevent unnecessary reactions from becoming permanent habits. The evenings become one of the best places to practice this discipline because silence naturally reveals whatever still holds emotional weight. Thoughts appear more clearly when distractions begin fading. Some ask for reflection. Others simply repeat themselves out of habit. Earlier in life, it may have seemed impossible to tell the difference. Every thought felt equally important because every thought demanded immediate attention. The pause changes that. Instead of chasing every mental conversation wherever it leads, you begin waiting long enough to see whether the thought still deserves your attention after the first emotional wave passes. Surprisingly often, it does not. The urgency belonged to the emotion rather than the situation itself. Once that urgency settles, clarity quietly takes its place. The mind begins recognizing that not everything demanding attention actually deserves it. This growing ability changes relationships in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. People often assume stronger relationships are built by finding the perfect words at exactly the right moment. More often, they are strengthened by resisting the impulse to speak before understanding has arrived. A pause prevents countless unnecessary arguments because it gives compassion enough time to replace assumption. It prevents misunderstandings from becoming lasting conflicts because it allows curiosity to appear before defensiveness closes every door. Even when disagreements remain, they no longer carry the same emotional intensity because your reactions are no longer being directed entirely by old patterns seeking familiar conclusions. The conversation changes because the person participating in it has quietly changed first. Over time, that brief pause becomes almost effortless. It no longer feels like a technique you are trying to remember. It becomes part of the way you naturally meet the world. Difficult emotions still arrive because they always will. Uncertainty remains part of life because no amount of preparation can remove it completely. But something fundamental has changed. You no longer surrender your peace during the first emotional surge. You remain present just long enough for awareness to quietly step forward. In that moment, old habits begin losing their certainty, wiser choices become easier to recognize, and the mind slowly discovers a steadiness that cannot be created through force alone. It grows one pause at a time until those invisible moments quietly become the strongest part of who you are. This constant stream of activity creates the comforting illusion that everything is under control. You answer messages, solve problems, complete familiar routines, and continue moving from one task to the next. Outwardly, the day appears productive. Internally, however, another process quietly continues without asking permission. Small frustrations collect in unnoticed corners of the mind. Disappointments that seemed insignificant at noon quietly remain present by sunset. An awkward conversation that lasted only a few minutes continues echoing beneath countless unrelated activities. Because attention never stays still for very long, these emotional traces remain largely invisible. They accompany you through the day without becoming the center of it. It feels as though they disappeared, when in reality they simply blended into the background noise of ordinary life. The mind keeps carrying them, even while pretending its hands are empty. Modern life encourages this pattern almost effortlessly. Moments that once belonged to reflection are now quickly filled with stimulation. Waiting in line becomes another opportunity to check a screen. Walking alone becomes another chance to listen to something. Even quiet meals often disappear beneath endless information. None of these habits are harmful by themselves. The difficulty begins when every empty space is immediately occupied, before the mind has a chance to reveal what it has been carrying. Silence gradually becomes unfamiliar. Stillness starts feeling uncomfortable. Many people reach for distraction before they even realize they are doing it. Not because they consciously wish to avoid themselves, but because they have quietly forgotten what uninterrupted awareness feels like. The habit becomes so natural that the absence of stimulation begins feeling more unusual than its constant presence. Night changes this rhythm almost without effort. One by one, the external demands begin falling away. Conversations come to an end. Responsibilities lose their urgency until morning. Notifications become less frequent. The world slowly becomes quieter, and with every layer of noise that disappears, another layer of the inner world becomes easier to hear. This is why certain thoughts seem to appear only after the lights have gone out. They were never waiting for the night itself. They were waiting for enough silence to finally become visible. The mind returns to unfinished experiences because nothing else is competing for its attention anymore. It is not creating unnecessary suffering. It is continuing conversations that never reached their natural conclusion during the busy hours of the day. This moment often feels uncomfortable, precisely because it is so honest. Earlier distractions no longer soften difficult emotions or pull attention away from unresolved questions. Memories that seemed forgotten quietly step forward. A disappointment you barely noticed that afternoon suddenly feels much clearer. Worries about tomorrow become easier to hear because today's noise has finally settled. Many people immediately interpret this as proof that they think too much at night. In reality, they are often thinking no more than before. They are simply hearing thoughts that daytime activity kept hidden beneath constant movement. The silence exposes what distraction temporarily concealed. Once you recognize this, the evening begins looking very different. Instead of becoming an enemy that produces anxious thoughts, it becomes a mirror reflecting what has already been present beneath awareness throughout the day. Something interesting begins happening once this perspective becomes familiar. The thoughts that once seemed overwhelming no longer arrive with the same intensity. They still appear, but they no longer feel like unexpected intruders breaking into an otherwise peaceful night. You recognize them as unfinished experiences asking for your attention, not permanent truths demanding your obedience. That recognition immediately changes the emotional atmosphere surrounding them. Fear softens because uncertainty no longer feels mysterious. Regret becomes easier to carry because it is finally being examined instead of repeatedly avoided. The silence itself remains unchanged, but your relationship with it grows noticeably calmer. You stop assuming that every difficult thought is evidence something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is simply evidence that the mind finally has enough room to speak honestly. This honesty gradually carries over into the rest of life. During the day, you become more aware of emotions while they are still small, instead of waiting until they grow louder at night. A brief moment of frustration is noticed before it quietly becomes resentment. A disappointment is acknowledged before it settles into expectation. Anxiety is recognized before imagination has time to expand it into something much larger than reality. Because these experiences receive attention earlier, they require less attention later. The evening no longer needs to carry the entire emotional weight of the day, because much of that weight has already been understood before darkness arrives. Over many nights, this quiet practice changes the meaning of stillness itself. Silence stops feeling like an empty space waiting to be filled. It becomes a place where hidden burdens gradually become visible enough to be released. The distractions of the day still exist, and there will always be responsibilities demanding your attention. But beneath all of them, another habit slowly develops. Instead of running from quiet moments, you begin welcoming them with steady curiosity. You understand that the mind is not trying to punish you when unresolved thoughts appear. It is simply offering another opportunity to see clearly what constant activity was never able to reveal. Little by little, those nightly moments of honest awareness begin changing not only the quality of your sleep, but also the quality of every day that follows. Instead of fearing those moments, begin seeing them as quiet invitations rather than unwanted interruptions. The mind has an interesting way of presenting what still needs attention when everything else becomes quiet enough to hear it. At first, this can feel deeply uncomfortable because most people spend years learning how to avoid difficult emotions rather than understand them. The instant sadness appears, they search for distraction. The moment regret begins speaking, they turn towards something louder. When uncertainty settles into the evening, they immediately look for anything capable of drowning it out. These reactions are understandable. No one naturally enjoys discomfort. Yet avoiding an emotion and resolving it are rarely the same thing. One postpones the experience, the other transforms your relationship with it. As Carl Jung observed, what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. As long as every uncomfortable feeling is treated as something dangerous, the mind never has the opportunity to discover that many of those feelings were asking to be understood rather than escaped. As this practice continues, discomfort gradually loses its ability to control the entire evening. The same emotions may still appear, but they no longer bring the same urgency with them. You become familiar with their rhythm. You recognize that sadness does not always require fixing. Fear does not always require obeying. Regret does not always require another hour of mental rehearsal. Sometimes these emotions simply need enough space to complete the conversation they have been trying to have all along. Once that conversation is finally allowed to unfold without interruption, something remarkable happens. The emotion often becomes quieter on its own, not because it was forced into silence, but because it no longer needed to shout in order to be noticed. Over time, this changes the way you understand yourself. Instead of seeing your difficult emotions as evidence that something is fundamentally wrong, you begin seeing them as messengers carrying information about your inner life. Some point toward old wounds, still asking for compassion. Others reveal expectations that quietly deserve to be released. A few remind you of values you wish to live by more consistently. None of these discoveries would have been possible if every uncomfortable feeling had been pushed away the moment it appeared. Clarity rarely arrives while you are running. It almost always finds you after you become still enough to see what was standing in front of you the entire time. Eventually, those quiet moments before sleep stop feeling like something to endure. They become moments you quietly respect, not because they are always comfortable, but because they continue revealing parts of yourself that constant movement could never uncover. The discomfort that once seemed unbearable gradually becomes the doorway through which deeper understanding enters. You stop measuring progress by how rarely difficult emotions appear. Instead, you notice how differently you meet them when they do. That difference changes everything. Little by little, the night becomes less about escaping your thoughts and more about becoming honest enough to discover that peace was never hiding from you. It was waiting patiently on the other side of the discomfort you had spent so many years trying to avoid. The more honestly you examine yourself before sleep, the less emotional weight you unknowingly carry into tomorrow. This has very little to do with perfection and everything to do with awareness. Many people end the day believing they have left it behind simply because the clock has moved forward. They assume yesterday disappears the moment a new morning begins. But the mind does not work according to calendars. It carries forward whatever remains unfinished. An unresolved argument becomes tomorrow's irritability. A quiet disappointment becomes tomorrow's lack of motivation. A fear that was never questioned quietly influences tomorrow's decisions before the day has even had a chance to unfold. Without realizing it, people often wake carrying emotions they never consciously chose to bring with them. They believe they are responding to the present when much of their emotional energy still belongs to the day before. This is why the final moments before sleep matter so deeply. They quietly determine how much of yesterday continues living inside tomorrow. The habit of honest reflection interrupts this invisible transfer. Instead of allowing experiences to accumulate unnoticed, you begin sorting through them while they are still fresh. You ask yourself what truly happened rather than what your emotions first insisted had happened. Sometimes you discover that a situation was not nearly as personal as it initially felt. Other times you recognize that your reaction had more to do with an old fear than the present moment itself. Occasionally you realize that something genuinely hurt you and deserves compassion instead of denial. Honest reflection does not force every experience into a positive lesson. It simply refuses to let confusion remain unquestioned. By doing so, it prevents unfinished emotions from quietly attaching themselves to another day. What could have become another invisible burden instead becomes another moment of understanding. Many emotional burdens become heavy only because they are carried far longer than necessary. A single criticism may last only a few seconds, yet the mind continues repeating it for weeks. One awkward conversation becomes a story retold countless times until it feels much larger than it ever was. A mistake that taught its lesson long ago continues appearing as though it still has unfinished business. The weight people carry is often not created by the original experience, but by the countless times they revisit it without discovering anything new. Each repetition adds another layer until the emotional burden feels inseparable from daily life. Reflection gently interrupts this accumulation. Instead of adding another layer, it begins removing the ones that no longer belong. Little by little, the mind becomes less crowded because it stops storing every emotional experience as though it deserved permanent residence. This is why emotional baggage is so difficult to recognize while you are carrying it. Unlike a physical burden, it has no visible shape. You cannot measure its weight with your hands or place it on the floor for a moment to see how heavy it has become. It quietly changes the way you experience ordinary life instead. Patience becomes shorter. Small inconveniences feel larger than they should. Joy arrives less often because attention remains occupied elsewhere. You may even begin believing that life itself has become more difficult, when in reality, much of the difficulty comes from carrying unresolved emotional weight from one day into the next. The burden becomes normal simply because it has been present for so long. Once something feels normal, people rarely question whether it still needs to be there. The quiet discipline of evening reflection gradually changes this relationship. You begin recognizing that not every experience deserves another tomorrow. Some conversations are finished, even if your mind keeps reopening them. Some disappointments have already taught everything they came to teach. Some worries exist only because they have been repeated so often that they feel more important than they truly are. This realization does not happen through force. You are not pushing thoughts away or pretending difficult experiences never happened. You are simply deciding, with greater wisdom than before, what deserves to remain part of your inner world. The difference is subtle but profound. Instead of carrying everything automatically, you begin carrying only what still serves a meaningful purpose. Night becomes the perfect setting for this practice because the pace of life naturally slows. Without the pressure to respond immediately to everything around you, attention gently turns inward. The mind becomes easier to observe because it is no longer constantly reacting to new information. This quieter atmosphere allows you to notice emotional patterns that remained hidden throughout the day. You see where frustration lingered longer than necessary. You recognize where fear quietly exaggerated reality. You notice moments where pride prevented understanding or where self-criticism became unnecessarily harsh. None of these observations require punishment. They simply require honesty. Honest awareness has an unusual ability to loosen emotional burdens because it removes the confusion surrounding them. Once you clearly see what you have been carrying, you become much better at deciding whether it still belongs with you. Over time, this nightly habit changes the emotional atmosphere with which you greet each morning. You begin waking with greater clarity because less unfinished emotion remains waiting beneath the surface. Yesterday still exists, but it no longer reaches so aggressively into today. The mind feels less crowded because unnecessary conversations quietly came to an end before sleep arrived. Even difficult circumstances become easier to navigate because they are no longer competing with layers of unresolved experiences from previous days. Presence becomes more natural when attention is no longer divided between today's responsibilities and yesterday's emotional leftovers. You discover that much of the peace you were searching for was never hidden inside perfect circumstances. It was hidden beneath emotional burdens that simply needed to be acknowledged before they could finally be released. Eventually, this practice becomes less like a routine and more like a way of living. Reflection no longer feels like another task added to the end of the day. It becomes an act of quiet respect toward yourself. You recognize that tomorrow deserves the clearest version of your attention, not whatever emotional residue happened to survive another evening without being examined. Little by little, the habit reshapes your inner world. The days still contain challenges, disappointments, and uncertainty because life has not changed its nature. What changes is what you choose to carry forward. Instead of collecting emotional weight until it quietly shapes your future, you learn to place it down while the day is still ending. Morning begins feeling lighter, not because the world has become easier, but because you arrive carrying far less than before. That quiet difference grows with every honest evening until the person waking each day is no longer burdened by countless unfinished yesterdays, but strengthened by the wisdom gained from finally letting them rest. Slowly, almost so gradually that you fail to notice it at first, your inner dialogue begins changing. The voice that once criticized every mistake no longer speaks with the same certainty. It still appears from time to time because old habits rarely disappear all at once, but something about its influence has shifted. It no longer sounds like an unquestionable authority. Instead, it becomes one opinion among many, and often not the wisest one. Earlier in life, a single setback may have been enough to convince you that you were falling behind. One awkward conversation could linger in your thoughts for days. One imperfect decision seemed capable of defining your entire character. As awareness grows stronger, those conclusions begin losing their grip. The mind stops rushing toward harsh judgments because it has learned that first impressions are not always faithful reflections of reality. There is now enough space for another response to emerge, one that values understanding more than condemnation. This change does not happen because you decide to become endlessly positive or because you begin pretending every difficulty contains an obvious blessing. It happens because your relationship with yourself becomes more honest. Honest people do not ignore their flaws, but they also refuse to exaggerate them. They acknowledge mistakes without turning them into permanent identities. They recognize weaknesses without allowing those weaknesses to erase every strength standing beside them. Earlier, your inner dialogue may have treated every failure as evidence that you were fundamentally inadequate. Now it begins asking quieter questions. What can this experience teach? What part of this truly belongs to me? And what part have I been carrying unnecessarily? These reflections do not excuse poor decisions, but they also refuse to transform temporary moments into lifelong definitions. That balance creates something remarkably rare. It allows growth without constant self-punishment. The mind gradually discovers that harshness was never the same as discipline. Many people confuse the two because they believe criticism keeps them accountable. They assume that speaking cruelly to themselves will somehow produce better results tomorrow. For a short time, that approach may create movement, but it almost always drains the spirit that genuine progress depends upon. Constant self-criticism leaves very little room for courage because every new attempt feels like another opportunity to confirm old fears. Patience works differently. It does not lower expectations or encourage complacency. It simply recognizes that meaningful change develops through consistency rather than constant emotional pressure. A patient mind is far more willing to continue learning because it no longer treats every imperfect step as proof that the journey should end. This quiet patience begins appearing in situations where frustration once arrived almost immediately. You notice yourself making a mistake, but instead of replaying it throughout the evening, you correct what you can and continue moving forward. You encounter a delay that would have ruined your mood months earlier, yet now you remain surprisingly steady. You catch yourself drifting into familiar worries before sleep, but instead of allowing them to occupy the entire night, you gently return your attention to the present. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. None of these moments feel dramatic while they are happening. They simply feel calmer. Only after enough time has passed do you realize that your emotional landscape has quietly changed. The situations remain familiar, yet the person experiencing them has become noticeably different. Discipline also begins taking on a new meaning. Earlier, discipline may have felt like forcing yourself through life with relentless pressure, believing that kindness toward yourself would weaken your resolve. Gradually, another understanding emerges. Real discipline is not built upon constant internal conflict. It grows through quiet consistency. It is choosing thoughtful responses even when emotional habits invite easier reactions. It is returning your attention to what matters after the mind wanders into old patterns. It is ending each day with honest reflection rather than endless judgment. These choices may appear small, but repeated often enough, they quietly reshape character. The strongest forms of discipline rarely announce themselves. They simply become part of the way you naturally move through ordinary life. As patience and discipline become more familiar, understanding begins occupying spaces once filled by assumption. Earlier, your mind often rushed to explain every difficult experience before enough evidence existed. Someone's silence became rejection. A temporary setback became permanent failure. Uncertainty became a reason to expect the worst. Those conclusions appeared quickly because they followed pathways worn smooth through years of repetition. Now another habit slowly replaces them. Instead of immediately deciding what something means, you allow yourself time to observe it more carefully. This simple willingness to wait often reveals that many emotional reactions were built upon incomplete stories. Reality becomes easier to see once the mind stops insisting upon instant conclusions. This transformation also changes the conversations you have with yourself at the end of the day. Instead of reviewing every mistake through the lens of regret, you begin examining the day with curiosity. You notice moments where you remained calm despite old habits inviting another response. You recognize places where greater patience is still needed, but without treating those observations as reasons for discouragement. Reflection becomes gentler without becoming dishonest. The purpose is no longer to find evidence that you are falling short. The purpose is to understand yourself well enough to continue growing tomorrow. That intention changes the emotional atmosphere surrounding each evening. Sleep begins arriving beside a quieter mind because the day's lessons have already been acknowledged without becoming another burden. Over many weeks and months, these subtle changes begin influencing far more than your private thoughts. The steadiness developing inside naturally appears in the way you speak, listen, and respond to others. Conversations become less defensive because your worth no longer feels threatened by every disagreement. Criticism becomes easier to receive because it is no longer filtered through years of unnecessary self-condemnation. Even silence begins feeling different. Earlier, silence often gave old judgments room to grow louder. Now it becomes a place where understanding quietly settles. You stop needing constant reassurance because your relationship with yourself has become less dependent upon perfect outcomes. That quiet confidence is not built upon believing you will never struggle again. It grows from knowing that when difficulties arrive, your first companion will no longer be relentless criticism. Instead, patience, discipline, and understanding will already be waiting beside you, ready to guide the conversation in a direction that leads not toward unnecessary suffering, but toward lasting inner strength. This transformation is rarely dramatic because real change almost never announces itself while it is happening. People often expect personal growth to arrive as a sudden breakthrough, a single unforgettable moment that permanently changes the way they think and feel. They wait for one powerful realization to erase years of emotional habits, believing that lasting peace should arrive all at once if they simply discover the right idea. Life unfolds differently. The deepest changes are usually so quiet that they escape attention entirely. They happen while ordinary evenings come and go. They develop through choices that seem too small to matter in the moment. One night you choose patience instead of another hour of unnecessary worry. Another night you allow a difficult emotion to exist without immediately resisting it. On another evening, you notice an old habit before it quietly takes control. None of these moments appear extraordinary by themselves, yet together they begin reshaping something far deeper than emotion alone. They gradually reshape character, one ordinary night at a time. This understanding removes unnecessary pressure from the process of growth. You no longer expect yourself to become emotionally unshakable after a single peaceful night or 1 week of disciplined reflection. Instead, you begin appreciating the quiet strength found in returning to the practice again and again. Progress is measured differently. Rather than asking whether everything has changed, you begin noticing whether something has changed. Perhaps your thoughts settle a little sooner than they once did. Perhaps a familiar disappointment no longer occupies your entire evening. Perhaps your first reaction softens before it becomes another emotional habit. These changes may appear modest, yet they reveal that something important is already happening beneath the surface. The foundation is quietly shifting long before the finished structure becomes visible. Nightly reflection becomes especially powerful because it creates consistency where emotional habits once created repetition. Earlier, the mind repeated worries without awareness, strengthened fears without questioning them, and carried unfinished emotions into every new day. Now another pattern gradually takes their place. Instead of automatically reinforcing old stories, you repeatedly return to observation, acceptance, and perspective. The subconscious learns through these repeated experiences just as faithfully as it once learned through anxiety or self-criticism. It does not distinguish between habits that weaken you and habits that strengthen you. It simply deepens whatever receives steady attention. This is why small nightly practices matter far more than occasional moments of intense motivation. Consistency quietly succeeds where emotional intensity eventually fades. Something beautiful begins happening as these evenings accumulate. The effort itself slowly becomes lighter. Earlier, remaining present with difficult thoughts required deliberate concentration because your mind instinctively followed familiar emotional pathways. After enough repetition, awareness begins arriving more naturally. Patience no longer feels forced. Reflection becomes less like a task and more like the way you naturally meet the end of each day. The same silence that once invited restless thinking now invites understanding. You stop needing constant reminders because the practice has gradually become part of your character instead of something you occasionally remember to do. This is how lasting habits are formed. They stop feeling separate from who you are and quietly become part of your ordinary way of living. Eventually, you begin looking back with quiet surprise. Situations that once seemed impossible to handle now feel manageable. Emotional storms that used to last for days pass much more quickly. Old habits still appear from time to time, but they no longer possess the same certainty they once carried. They have become visitors rather than permanent residents. This realization rarely arrives during one extraordinary evening. It appears while reflecting on how different your responses have become compared to months or even years earlier. You recognize that countless small choices, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, have quietly built a stronger foundation beneath your life. This new perspective naturally softens conflict. Many disagreements become far less intense because you no longer interpret every difference of opinion as a personal attack. Someone may disagree with your ideas without rejecting your value. Someone may be struggling with burdens you know nothing about, causing them to speak with unnecessary sharpness. Another person may simply see life through experiences entirely different from your own. Earlier, your first reaction may have been immediate defensiveness. Now another possibility quietly appears. Instead of instantly protecting your pride, you become curious about what might exist beyond the surface of the conversation. Curiosity does not remove disagreement, but it prevents unnecessary emotional escalation. The need to always defend yourself slowly gives way to the willingness to understand before responding. This does not mean becoming passive or allowing people to treat you without respect. Healthy boundaries remain just as important as they always were. The difference is found in the emotional atmosphere surrounding those boundaries. They are no longer built from resentment or fear. They grow from clarity. You recognize what behavior deserves your attention and what behavior belongs entirely to the other person. You stop carrying responsibility for emotions that were never yours to manage. This quiet discernment creates remarkable emotional freedom because you no longer feel obligated to solve every misunderstanding or convince everyone to see life exactly as you do. Some conversations simply end without complete agreement, and surprisingly, peace remains intact. The need for constant resolution gradually gives way to acceptance that different minds often reach different conclusions. Even forgiveness begins changing its meaning. Earlier, forgiveness may have felt like pretending painful experiences never happened or excusing behavior that genuinely caused harm. Now it becomes something much quieter. It is the decision to stop allowing another person's actions to occupy unnecessary space inside your own mind. The past remains part of your history, but it no longer receives unlimited influence over your present emotional state. This does not happen overnight, nor does it erase legitimate pain. It simply reflects the understanding that carrying resentment indefinitely rarely punishes the other person. More often, it quietly punishes the one carrying it. Letting go becomes less about what others deserve and more about the peace you no longer wish to postpone. As these changes continue unfolding, relationships themselves become lighter. Conversations no longer require constant self-protection because your sense of worth is less fragile than before. You listen more carefully because your mind is no longer preparing its defense before the other person has finished speaking. Patience appears more naturally because urgency no longer dominates every emotional exchange. Even silence becomes easier to share. Earlier, silence may have been filled with assumptions about what someone else was thinking. Now it often remains simply silence, free from unnecessary interpretation. This growing steadiness creates space for deeper connection because people feel less pressure to satisfy emotional expectations they never knew they were carrying. The most surprising change often appears in situations that once seemed impossible to navigate peacefully. Someone behaves unfairly, yet bitterness no longer controls the entire day. A misunderstanding occurs, but it no longer follows you into the evening. Criticism arrives, yet your first instinct is no longer to measure your worth against another person's opinion. None of this means you have stopped caring about people. In many ways, you begin caring more deeply because your concern is no longer mixed with constant emotional dependence. Compassion becomes easier when fear is no longer directing every interaction. Respect grows stronger because it is offered freely rather than exchanged as a condition for inner peace. Over time, you realize that the greatest transformation did not happen in your relationships alone. It happened in the person bringing themselves into those relationships. External conflicts still appear because life has not changed its nature. Different personalities continue colliding. Difficult conversations remain part of being human. Yet much of the emotional intensity surrounding those moments quietly disappears because your inner world is no longer so easily shaken by every external event. The calm you once searched for in other people's behavior has gradually been built within yourself. From that place, relationships stop becoming constant emotional battles and begin feeling like opportunities to practice the same patience, understanding, and quiet strength you have spent so many evenings cultivating in the silence of your own mind. You stop expecting other people to heal wounds they never created, and that realization quietly changes the direction of your life. Earlier, this idea may have sounded unfair because many of your deepest hurts genuinely involved other people. Someone broke your trust, someone failed to understand you, someone spoke carelessly at a moment when you needed compassion. Those experiences were real, and their impact should never be dismissed. But there is an important difference between acknowledging where the pain began and deciding who remains responsible for carrying it forever. The person who caused a wound may have influenced your past, yet they do not have to continue influencing your future. Somewhere along the way, responsibility gently returns to you, not because you deserved what happened, but because only you can decide what continues living inside your mind after the moment itself has passed. That realization does not create resentment. It creates freedom because it quietly places your peace back into hands that are always with you. Many people spend years waiting for emotional closure to arrive from outside themselves. They hope someone will finally apologize in exactly the right way. They imagine one conversation that explains everything, one moment of recognition that suddenly makes years of confusion disappear. Sometimes those moments happen. Very often they do not. Even when they do, they rarely provide the lasting peace people expected. The apology is appreciated, yet the emotional burden somehow remains. The explanation answers certain questions, but another part of the mind still feels unsettled. This happens because healing and validation are not the same experience. Validation can acknowledge your pain. Healing transforms your relationship with it. One depends upon another person's actions. The other quietly begins the moment you become willing to care for your own inner world without waiting for permission from anyone else. This shift is not about blaming yourself for what others did. It is about recognizing the difference between cause and responsibility. Someone else may have planted the seed of fear, disappointment, or insecurity through their actions. They may have contributed to emotional wounds you never asked to carry, but they cannot complete the healing on your behalf because healing happens inside your own awareness. Waiting for another person to restore your peace gives them influence they may never even realize they possess. Your emotional life becomes suspended between what already happened and what you hope someone else will eventually do. The longer that waiting continues, the longer your peace quietly remains postponed. Freedom begins when you gently reclaim that responsibility without denying the reality of what you experienced. This understanding often arrives slowly because the mind naturally searches for external explanations before looking inward. It feels easier to believe peace will finally arrive once other people behave differently, understand you more completely, or acknowledge the pain they caused. There is comfort in imagining that the solution exists somewhere outside yourself because it postpones the difficult work of honest reflection. Yet life repeatedly demonstrates something else. People remain imperfect. Some never recognize the consequences of their actions. Others carry struggles that prevent them from offering the understanding you hope to receive. If your peace depends entirely upon their transformation, it remains vulnerable to circumstances you cannot control. The Stoic path gently redirects attention toward the one place where meaningful influence has always existed. It asks not whether the past can be rewritten, but whether your relationship with the past can quietly become wiser. Responsibility begins feeling different as well. Earlier, responsibility may have sounded heavy, almost like another obligation added to an already demanding life. Gradually, it reveals a gentler meaning. It is no longer about controlling everything that happens around you. It is about caring for what happens within you after life unfolds according to its own unpredictable nature. Someone else's behavior remains outside your authority. Your response remains within it. Circumstances continue changing beyond your preference. The meaning you attach to those circumstances becomes yours to examine. This responsibility does not feel restrictive. It feels liberating because it returns your attention to the place where meaningful change is actually possible. Energy once spent wishing the past were different begins flowing toward creating a steadier present instead. Even your evenings begin changing as this understanding settles into your life. Earlier, quiet moments before sleep may have been occupied by imaginary conversations, endless explanations, or repeated attempts to understand why someone acted the way they did. Night after night, the mind quietly rehearsed situations that no longer offered anything new. As responsibility returns inward, those conversations gradually lose their urgency. You realize that complete understanding of another person's choices is not required before allowing yourself to rest. Some questions remain unanswered. Some stories never receive perfect endings. Surprisingly, peace begins arriving anyway. Not because every mystery has been solved, but because your emotional well-being is no longer waiting for someone else to finish a journey only you can complete. This quiet change also strengthens your relationships with others. When you stop asking people to heal wounds they never created, you stop placing invisible expectations upon them. New relationships are no longer burdened by unresolved fears from old ones. Conversations become more genuine because they are no longer filtered through constant emotional self-protection. You begin seeing people more clearly instead of viewing them through the lens of earlier disappointments. Compassion grows naturally because your attention is less occupied by guarding old pain. You remain capable of setting healthy boundaries, yet those boundaries are built from wisdom rather than fear. They protect your peace without isolating your heart. Eventually, you realize that real freedom was never hidden inside another person's apology, approval, or understanding. Those things may still carry value, but they are no longer the foundation upon which your inner life depends. That foundation has quietly returned to where it always belonged. Each evening becomes another opportunity to release what no longer deserves another tomorrow. Each morning begins with a little less emotional weight because responsibility has found its way back to the only place where lasting peace could ever truly grow. The past remains part of your story, but it no longer owns the pen. From this point forward, the life unfolding before you is shaped less by what others failed to give and more by what you patiently choose to cultivate within yourself, one quiet night after another. This is where quiet awareness becomes so important. Instead of allowing yesterday to quietly interpret today without question, you begin noticing when old emotional patterns step into new experiences uninvited. A simple disagreement no longer has to become evidence that every relationship is unstable. One difficult day no longer has to convince you that progress has disappeared. A temporary feeling of uncertainty no longer needs to become proof that the future will unfold according to old disappointments. The present moment deserves the opportunity to exist without constantly carrying the emotional weight of experiences that belong somewhere else. That opportunity appears only when awareness gently interrupts automatic conclusions before they quietly become another familiar story. The evenings reveal this difference more clearly than almost any other time of day. As the world grows quiet, old memories sometimes return with surprising clarity. Earlier, these moments may have pulled you into hours of regret, anger, or endless mental conversations that never reached satisfying conclusions. Gradually, another possibility begins emerging. The memory appears, but you no longer instinctively surrender the entire night to it. You acknowledge what happened. You recognize the emotions it once carried. Then, instead of allowing the experience to quietly decide how tomorrow will feel, you gently return your attention to the present moment. The memory remains part of your story, but it no longer controls the direction of the next chapter. That small difference slowly changes the emotional atmosphere surrounding each evening, because the past is no longer invited to rewrite the future every time it knocks at the door of your awareness. This practice also changes the way you understand healing itself. Healing is often imagined as the complete disappearance of pain, as though success means never remembering difficult experiences again. Life rarely unfolds that way. Certain memories remain because they shaped important parts of your journey. The goal is not to erase them. The goal is to loosen their authority. A healed wound may still leave a scar, but the scar no longer dictates how you move through each day. It reminds you of where you have been without preventing you from continuing forward. Emotional healing follows a similar path. The memory remains available, yet it no longer decides your mood before breakfast, your confidence before new opportunities, or your peace before sleep. The experience belongs to your past without continuing to own your present. Little by little, yesterday loses its invisible authority. The lessons remain because they continue offering wisdom. The unnecessary emotional weight quietly fades because it is no longer strengthened through constant repetition. You stop measuring tomorrow according to what happened before and begin allowing each new day to arrive with its own possibilities. This is not blind optimism or forced positivity. It is disciplined presence. It is the quiet decision to meet life as it unfolds, instead of asking every new moment to answer for the mistakes, disappointments and fears that belong to another time. From that place, peace stops depending upon changing the past. It grows from refusing to let the past quietly decide the emotional meaning of a future that has not even begun. This quiet transition matters because character is rarely shaped during extraordinary moments alone. More often, it develops through the ordinary habits repeated when nobody else is watching. A single evening of patient reflection may appear insignificant, yet repeated across months and years, it quietly changes the direction of an entire life. The mind remembers what is practiced consistently. If every night ends with endless worry, fear slowly becomes familiar. If every evening concludes with honest observation, acceptance and perspective, those qualities also begin settling into the deeper layers of your thinking. You are not merely ending another day. You are teaching the subconscious what deserves to continue and what no longer belongs. That lesson repeats itself while the body rests, allowing tomorrow to begin from a different emotional foundation than yesterday ended. Many people underestimate this process because they expect visible progress. They hope to wake one morning completely transformed, free from every lingering fear or emotional burden. Change rarely announces itself so dramatically. Instead, mornings begin feeling slightly different in ways that are easy to overlook. You wake with less mental heaviness than before. Certain worries no longer greet you the moment your eyes open. A familiar memory appears, yet it carries less emotional intensity than it once did. These changes seem almost too subtle to matter, but they reveal something important. The quiet work taking place each evening is slowly influencing the person waking each morning. Growth continues while you sleep, because the habits practiced before sleep continue shaping the mind long after conscious awareness has faded. As this rhythm becomes familiar, sleep itself begins carrying a sense of quiet purpose. You no longer rush toward unconsciousness simply to escape the day behind you. You allow the day to conclude with honesty first. Whatever deserves gratitude is acknowledged. Whatever deserves correction is recognized without harshness. Whatever no longer serves you is gently placed down instead of being carried forward out of habit. This simple practice creates emotional continuity between one day and the next. Tomorrow is no longer forced to begin beneath yesterday's unfinished weight, because much of that weight has already been examined with patience. Rest becomes deeper because the mind is no longer struggling to organize countless unresolved experiences while you sleep. It enters the night with greater order, allowing restoration to reach beyond the body into the quieter places where character is slowly formed. Eventually, you stop thinking of sleep as a passive experience that simply happens at the end of every day. It becomes an active part of the life you are intentionally building. Each evening offers another chance to strengthen the qualities you wish to carry into the future while gently releasing those that no longer belong. Morning arrives not because time has moved forward, but because another quiet transformation has already begun beneath awareness. The world outside may remain unchanged when you open your eyes, yet something inside continues becoming steadier, clearer, and more deliberate than it was the night before. That is the hidden gift waiting within every peaceful evening. Sleep ceases to be merely the place where today's fatigue comes to an end. It becomes the quiet passage through which yesterday slowly gives way to the wiser, calmer person you are patiently becoming, one intentional night at a time. Every peaceful night quietly strengthens something that cannot easily be seen from the outside. It is not simply giving the body another opportunity to recover from physical effort. It is teaching the mind how to meet tomorrow differently. Earlier, each new challenge often pulled you immediately into familiar emotional habits before awareness had time to arrive. A small inconvenience became lasting frustration. Unexpected criticism shaped the rest of the day. Uncertainty quietly grew into anxiety before any real evidence existed. These reactions felt natural because they had been practiced countless times before. The mind had become remarkably efficient at repeating them. As Epictetus observed, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. Now another pattern slowly begins taking their place. Each evening spent calming unnecessary mental noise becomes another lesson in steadiness. Night after night, the mind quietly learns that not every situation requires immediate emotional surrender. This lesson becomes part of you long before you consciously notice it appearing in daily life. This happens because the mind remembers whatever it practices consistently. Earlier, evenings often reinforced restless thinking. Worries were repeated before sleep. Regrets were replayed. Imaginary conversations quietly continued long after they had ended in reality. Those nightly habits strengthened emotional pathways that naturally reappeared the following day. Without intending to, you practiced reacting before reflecting. As your evenings become calmer, another form of repetition quietly replaces the old one. You repeatedly return to patience instead of urgency. You repeatedly choose observation before judgment. You repeatedly allow difficult thoughts to pass without following every one of them into endless conclusions. The subconscious gradually accepts these experiences as the new pattern worth preserving. By morning, those repeated moments have already begun influencing the way you meet whatever life places in front of you. This transformation rarely announces itself while it is happening. More often, you recognize it only after looking back. A situation that once would have ruined your entire afternoon now occupies only a few quiet minutes before your attention naturally returns to the present. Someone else's criticism still stings, but it no longer echoes throughout the entire evening. An unexpected delay interrupts carefully made plans, yet you notice yourself adjusting with surprising ease instead of immediately becoming overwhelmed. None of these moments feel extraordinary while they unfold. They simply feel calmer than they once did. Only later do you realize that your mind has quietly learned another way of responding because of countless peaceful nights spent strengthening awareness instead of automatic reaction. This growing steadiness also changes the way you experience uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty often demanded immediate answers because unanswered questions felt emotionally unsafe. The mind searched relentlessly for certainty, believing that peace could only exist once every possible outcome had been predicted. Gradually, another understanding begins taking root. You recognize that uncertainty has always been part of life. The difference is that it no longer feels like an emergency. Peace becomes less dependent upon knowing exactly what tomorrow will bring, because you have begun trusting the quality of your own response more than the predictability of external circumstances. That trust grows quietly each evening as you repeatedly practice remaining present with thoughts that once would have immediately carried you into fear. This practice also reshapes the emotional rhythm of ordinary days. Earlier, a single unpleasant event often influenced everything that followed. One frustrating conversation colored the next several hours. One disappointing email affected every interaction afterward. One anxious thought quietly shaped the mood of the entire day. As the mind becomes steadier, emotional experiences begin remaining closer to the moments where they actually belong. Disappointment still exists, but it no longer expands into every unrelated situation. Frustration appears, yet it fades instead of collecting companions along the way. Joy becomes easier to notice because attention is no longer constantly occupied by emotional echoes from earlier experiences. The present moment gradually regains the space that old reactions once occupied without permission. Perhaps the greatest gift of this process is the confidence it quietly creates. Not confidence built upon believing life will always be easy, but confidence rooted in knowing that you no longer need perfect circumstances to remain emotionally grounded. Challenges continue arriving because that is simply part of being alive. Unexpected losses, difficult conversations, and uncertain seasons remain woven into every human life. What changes is your relationship with them. Instead of feeling controlled by every emotional wave, you begin trusting your ability to remain present until wiser responses naturally emerge. That trust cannot be purchased, borrowed, or inherited. It is built one peaceful evening at a time through repeated moments of awareness that quietly become part of your character. Eventually, every peaceful night becomes far more than another opportunity for rest. It becomes another quiet investment in the person you are becoming. The calm cultivated in silence follows you into conversations, decisions, disappointments, and moments of uncertainty. Long before anyone else notices the difference, your own mind begins recognizing familiar challenges without automatically following familiar reactions. The same world still exists around you, filled with unpredictability, change, and occasional hardship. Yet within that same world, another kind of stability has quietly taken root. It is strengthened each night through patient reflection, gentle awareness, and the simple decision to meet yourself with honesty before sleep. When morning arrives, you carry more than renewed energy. You carry a steadier mind, one increasingly capable of choosing calm where it once knew only reaction, and that quiet ability continues growing with every peaceful night that follows. Gradually, almost without realizing when it began, you notice that situations which once disturbed you now pass through your mind with surprising ease. The circumstances themselves have not changed very much. Life continues bringing delays, misunderstandings, disappointments, and moments that refuse to unfold according to your plans. People still have difficult days. Unexpected problems still appear without warning. The difference lies somewhere much quieter than the events themselves. Earlier, every inconvenience seemed capable of reaching deep into your emotional world, leaving a mark that remained long after the situation had ended. Now those same experiences still arrive, but they no longer settle in the same way. They touch your awareness without immediately becoming part of your identity. The mind has quietly learned that not every disturbance deserves permanent residence. Some moments belong only to themselves, and allowing them to remain there becomes one of the greatest forms of inner freedom. This change often feels almost confusing because it happens so naturally. You may find yourself leaving a difficult conversation without replaying every sentence for the rest of the evening. A criticism that once would have followed you for days now occupies only a few thoughtful moments before quietly fading into the background. An unexpected setback still requires your attention, but it no longer convinces you that everything else is falling apart. None of these experiences become smaller in an objective sense. Instead, your relationship with them becomes healthier. You stop adding unnecessary emotional weight to situations that are already complete. Once something has happened, it no longer needs to happen again inside your mind 100 different times. That quiet realization saves an incredible amount of emotional energy that was previously spent fighting battles that had already ended. This is not because you have become indifferent. In fact, many people misunderstand emotional steadiness by assuming it requires caring less about life. The opposite is often true. You begin caring more wisely. Instead of investing your attention equally in every passing frustration, you become more selective about where your emotional energy belongs. Some moments deserve deep reflection because they reveal something important about your values, your character, or the direction of your life. Others deserve only acknowledgement before being allowed to continue on their way. Earlier, everything felt equally urgent because the mind had not yet learned the difference. Now discernment quietly replaces emotional impulse. That simple shift changes the quality of every ordinary day because attention is no longer constantly scattered across experiences that no longer deserve it. One reason this transformation feels so significant is that peace gradually stops depending upon perfect circumstances. Earlier, calm often seemed fragile. It survived only while everything unfolded according to expectation. As soon as plans changed or someone behaved unfairly, that calm quickly disappeared. This created a difficult way of living because external conditions are constantly changing. There will always be delays, misunderstandings, disappointments, and uncertainties waiting somewhere ahead. Building peace upon circumstances is like building a house upon moving water. No matter how carefully it is constructed, instability eventually appears. Through quiet reflection, another foundation slowly begins forming. Instead of asking the world to remain predictable before allowing yourself to feel settled, you begin carrying that steadiness with you into whatever the world happens to bring. This does not mean difficult emotions disappear forever. They still arrive because they remain part of being human. Sadness continues visiting during seasons of loss. Frustration appears when plans unexpectedly collapse. Fear still whispers whenever life enters unfamiliar territory. The important difference is that these emotions no longer become permanent guides directing every decision. They are experienced honestly without being given complete control. Earlier, one emotional wave often carried the entire mind with it. Now the wave still rises, but something steady remains beneath it. You recognize that feelings naturally change, and because of that understanding, you stop treating each emotional moment as though it represents an unchanging truth about your life. The emotion passes while your deeper sense of balance quietly remains. The evenings continue strengthening this way of living because they repeatedly remind you how temporary most disturbances truly are. Thoughts that felt overwhelming during the afternoon often appear much smaller after patient reflection. Conversations that seemed impossible to stop replaying eventually lose their urgency once they are observed calmly instead of endlessly repeated. The mind begins recognizing this pattern through experience rather than theory. It learns that emotional storms naturally settle when they are not constantly fed with additional attention. This quiet confidence changes tomorrow before tomorrow even begins. You fall asleep carrying fewer unfinished emotional conversations, and you wake with greater space available for whatever the new day asks of you. As this becomes your normal way of living, another unexpected change quietly appears. You stop measuring your days according to how many problems occurred and begin noticing how you responded to them instead. Earlier, a difficult day automatically became a bad day. Now you recognize that challenge and suffering are not always the same experience. A demanding conversation can still contain patience. A disappointing outcome can still contain gratitude. An uncertain future can still contain quiet confidence. Circumstances continue changing from one day to the next, but your inner response becomes increasingly stable because it is no longer built entirely upon external conditions. This realization quietly changes the way you understand success itself. Success becomes less about controlling everything around you and more about remaining faithful to the qualities you wish to carry, regardless of what life presents. People around you often begin noticing this before you do. Conversations with you feel calmer. Difficult situations no longer escalate as quickly because your emotional state is not immediately pulled into every conflict. You become easier to trust because your reactions grow more consistent. This does not happen because you are trying to impress anyone. It happens because inner steadiness naturally expresses itself outwardly. Calmness has a quiet influence that requires no explanation. Others sense it long before they understand where it came from. The countless evenings spent practicing awareness, patience, and honest reflection begin appearing in ordinary moments that seem completely unrelated to those quiet nights. What once happened only in silence gradually becomes part of the way you move through the entire world. Eventually, you realize that peace has become something entirely different from what you once imagined. It is no longer a reward waiting at the end of perfect circumstances or flawless days. It has become a quiet companion that remains with you through both pleasant and difficult moments alike. The world continues changing because that is its nature. Some days bring unexpected joy, others bring disappointment, and many bring both at the same time. Yet beneath all those changing experiences, something steady continues growing. Your mind no longer clings so tightly to every passing disturbance because it has learned that lasting peace was never created by controlling the world. It was quietly built through countless evenings of returning your attention to what truly matters, until the person meeting each new day became stronger than the circumstances trying to disturb them. This growing emotional stability is often misunderstood because it looks very different from what many people expect. From the outside, someone who has become calmer may appear less emotional than before, leading others to assume they have simply stopped caring. The truth is almost the opposite. Emotional stability is not emotional numbness. It is not the absence of feeling, nor is it the result of building walls so high that nothing can reach the heart. Feelings continue arriving with the same honesty they always have. Joy still feels meaningful. Disappointment still hurts. Loss still carries its natural weight. Compassion remains just as deep. The difference is found in what happens after those emotions appear. Instead of immediately allowing them to determine every thought, every decision, and every reaction, you quietly create enough space for understanding to join the conversation. Over time, that small habit becomes one of the greatest sources of inner freedom, because your emotional life is no longer controlled by whichever feeling happened to arrive first. Earlier, emotions often behaved like sudden storms. A single event could completely change the direction of an entire day. Someone's words echoed endlessly in your thoughts. An unexpected setback spread frustration into conversations that had nothing to do with the original problem. Fear quietly attached itself to situations that had not even unfolded yet. None of this happened because you were weak. It happened because the mind naturally followed emotional pathways it had practiced for years. Once a feeling appeared, habit immediately stepped forward and continued the story without asking whether another response might be possible. Everything moved so quickly that awareness struggled to keep pace. The feeling arrived, the reaction followed, and only much later did reflection quietly ask whether things could have unfolded differently. As patient awareness develops, this familiar pattern begins changing. The emotion still appears because emotions remain part of being alive. But instead of instantly becoming the center of your entire experience, it becomes something you are capable of observing with greater clarity. You notice frustration while recognizing that frustration does not have to choose your next words. You feel fear without immediately assuming fear understands the future. Sadness arrives, yet it is no longer mistaken for permanent hopelessness. These distinctions seem almost invisible while they are happening, yet they quietly reshape the emotional atmosphere surrounding everyday life. Feelings stop functioning like commands that demand immediate obedience. They become valuable signals, offering information without automatically taking complete control. This shift happens because understanding slowly replaces urgency. Earlier, uncomfortable emotions seemed to require immediate action. If anger appeared, the mind searched for someone to blame. If anxiety surfaced, it demanded certainty before allowing peace to return. If disappointment arrived, it quickly began constructing stories about what the future would probably become. The emotional response felt so convincing that there seemed little reason to question it. Gradually, another possibility emerges. Instead of rushing to satisfy every emotional impulse, you remain still long enough to understand where the feeling came from. Sometimes it reflects the present moment, honestly. Other times it carries echoes from experiences that happened years ago. That quiet investigation often reveals that the emotion itself was never the problem. The problem came from assuming every feeling deserved immediate belief before understanding had an opportunity to appear. This is why emotional stability should never be confused with emotional suppression. Suppression pushes emotions deeper beneath awareness while pretending they no longer exist. Stability gently welcomes them into awareness without allowing them to quietly govern everything that follows. There is remarkable strength in feeling something deeply without becoming completely consumed by it. A difficult conversation can still hurt while leaving your sense of worth untouched. A disappointing outcome can still deserve sadness without convincing you that all future efforts will fail. Even grief, one of life's deepest emotional experiences, can exist alongside quiet acceptance rather than endless resistance. None of this removes pain from the human experience. It simply prevents pain from becoming the only experience available. Night after night, this understanding continues strengthening through repeated practice. The evenings become opportunities to observe emotional patterns instead of automatically continuing them. Earlier, a difficult day often followed you into bed exactly as it happened, bringing every frustration, every regret, and every unfinished conversation into another restless night. Now, the same experiences are met differently. You acknowledge what happened honestly. You notice the emotions that remain. Then, instead of feeding them endless attention, you gently ask what deserves to continue into tomorrow and what has already served its purpose. This simple discipline teaches the subconscious something important. It learns that difficult emotions do not always require endless rehearsal before they can finally be released. As this habit becomes familiar, emotional resilience quietly grows beneath ordinary life. Situations that once produced immediate frustration now invite thoughtful observation first. Fear still whispers, but it no longer speaks with unquestioned authority. Criticism still reaches you, yet it no longer defines your entire evening. This change is not dramatic because it develops through hundreds of small decisions rather than one extraordinary breakthrough. Each evening spent choosing understanding instead of impulsive reaction quietly strengthens another layer of character. Eventually, these repeated choices become so natural that they no longer feel like techniques at all. They simply become part of the way you experience the world. People sometimes worry that becoming emotionally steady will somehow make life less meaningful. They fear calmness might reduce passion or weaken their ability to love deeply. The opposite often proves true. When your emotions are no longer constantly pulled in every direction by impulse, you become more available for what genuinely matters. You listen more carefully because defensiveness no longer interrupts every conversation. You appreciate joyful moments more fully because your attention is not trapped inside endless emotional noise. Compassion becomes easier because your own inner struggles no longer occupy every corner of your awareness. Presence quietly replaces emotional turbulence, allowing life to be experienced with greater depth rather than less. Eventually, you recognize that emotional stability was never about becoming someone who rarely feels. It was always about becoming someone who understands what they feel before deciding what to do with it. That distinction changes everything. Feelings continue arriving because they remain part of being human. What changes is the wisdom accompanying them. Instead of reacting automatically, you repeatedly choose understanding. Those choices accumulate one quiet evening at a time until calmness is no longer something you occasionally experience. It becomes part of your character, shaping every conversation, every challenge, and every new beginning with a quiet strength that cannot be created through force alone, but only through patient repetition and honest self-awareness. The subconscious changes in a way that often surprises people because it pays far less attention to dramatic moments than it does to repeated ones. Many assume lasting transformation comes from one powerful realization, one unforgettable speech, or one evening filled with extraordinary motivation. Those experiences can certainly inspire action, but inspiration alone rarely reshapes the deeper patterns guiding everyday life. Motivation rises quickly, burns brightly for a short time, and then gradually fades as ordinary routines return. The subconscious was never designed to build itself around temporary emotional intensity. It learns through repetition. It quietly observes what you return to day after day, especially when no one is watching and nothing remarkable seems to be happening. Those ordinary moments become the true teachers of the mind. They reveal what you genuinely believe because they reveal what you consistently practice. Night after night, those repeated practices slowly become familiar, and familiarity quietly becomes the foundation upon which character continues growing. Think about how every meaningful skill develops. No one learns to speak a language because of one inspiring lesson. No musician masters an instrument after a single evening of practice. No tree becomes strong because of one day of sunlight. Growth happens because small actions continue long after excitement disappears. The mind follows the same principle. One peaceful evening before sleep may feel refreshing, but it is the second evening, the 10th evening, and the 100th evening that begin quietly changing the subconscious. Repetition sends a message stronger than intention alone ever could. It tells the deeper mind that this way of thinking is not temporary. It belongs here now. Slowly, new emotional pathways become easier to follow because they have been traveled often enough to feel familiar. What once required deliberate effort gradually becomes the natural direction your attention chooses without constant reminders. This is why consistency carries such quiet power. It removes the pressure to produce dramatic change overnight and replaces it with something far more dependable. You no longer judge your progress according to how inspired you happen to feel today. Instead, you simply return to the same steady practice regardless of whether the evening feels especially meaningful. Some nights bring remarkable clarity. Other nights feel completely ordinary. The subconscious makes little distinction between them. It simply notices that you continue returning. You continue observing instead of immediately reacting. You continue examining your thoughts with honesty instead of allowing them to quietly shape tomorrow without question. Those repeated choices become stronger than temporary emotion because they slowly stop depending upon emotion altogether. They become habits, and habits quietly shape the direction of an entire life. Earlier, the subconscious learned through repetition as well, though often without your awareness. Worry repeated itself often enough that it became familiar. Self-criticism returned so consistently that it eventually sounded like your own voice. Fear quietly rehearsed possible disappointments until expecting the worst began feeling realistic. None of these patterns appeared overnight. They developed through countless ordinary moments repeated without interruption. Once you recognize this, something encouraging becomes visible. The same mind that learned those habits is fully capable of learning healthier ones. The mechanism has never been working against you. It has simply been responding faithfully to whatever received the greatest amount of attention. The direction changes when the repetition changes. Little by little, patience becomes just as familiar as worry once was. Perspective begins replacing impulse because it is now receiving the same steady practice that fear previously received. This understanding removes one of the greatest obstacles to personal growth. Many people become discouraged because they still experience old thoughts, even after beginning healthier practices. They assume the appearance of familiar emotions means nothing has changed. In reality, old habits often continue appearing while new ones are quietly becoming stronger beneath the surface. The subconscious does not erase years of repetition in a single week. It gradually shifts its loyalty toward whatever continues receiving consistent attention. During this transition, both patterns may exist side by side. Some evenings still feel restless, others feel surprisingly peaceful. Neither experience determines the final outcome. What matters most is which pattern continues receiving patient reinforcement. The mind eventually follows what has become most familiar, and familiarity is created through steady repetition rather than occasional emotional breakthroughs. The evenings become especially valuable because they offer one of the most consistent opportunities to strengthen these healthier patterns. Regardless of what happened during the day, the quiet before sleep returns again. It becomes another invitation to observe rather than automatically believe every passing thought. Another opportunity to release unnecessary emotional burdens before they quietly settle into tomorrow. Another chance to remind the subconscious that understanding deserves more attention than endless mental rehearsal. These moments may seem small while they are happening, but the subconscious quietly gathers them together. It remembers each return to awareness. It notices every time you interrupt an old emotional pattern before it completely unfolds. Those moments accumulate until calm reflection begins feeling more natural than emotional reactivity once did. Over time, this consistency changes something deeper than behavior alone. It changes expectation. The mind gradually begins expecting patience instead of panic. It begins anticipating thoughtful observation instead of immediate judgment. Earlier, emotional storms often seemed inevitable because the subconscious had practiced them so thoroughly. Now another expectation slowly takes their place. Difficult emotions still arrive, yet the mind quietly remembers that they can be observed without immediately taking control. That memory becomes stronger each evening you reinforce it. Eventually, it appears automatically, offering steadiness before old habits have the opportunity to dominate your attention. The subconscious has quietly learned another way of responding because you patiently taught it through repetition instead of demanding instant transformation through willpower alone. Perhaps the most comforting part of this process is its simplicity. You do not need extraordinary talent or endless motivation to reshape the direction of your inner life. You simply need the willingness to return. Return to awareness when the mind begins wandering into familiar fears. Return to patience when self-criticism grows louder than understanding. Return to honest reflection before sleep instead of carrying every unfinished emotion into another day. These repeated returns become the quiet language through which the subconscious learns. Each one may appear insignificant on its own, yet together they create a completely different emotional foundation beneath ordinary life. Eventually, you stop depending upon rare moments of inspiration to maintain your peace, because peace has become supported by something far more reliable. It rests upon habits patiently strengthened through countless ordinary evenings. The subconscious no longer waits for motivation before choosing healthier patterns because those patterns have become familiar through steady practice. They now belong to the natural rhythm of your thinking. The person waking each morning gradually responds with greater clarity, not because life has become easier, but because the deeper mind has quietly adopted new ways of seeing, feeling, and responding. All of this began through simple consistency, repeated often enough that what once felt unfamiliar slowly became the most natural part of who you are. Over time, your mornings begin feeling different in ways that are difficult to explain at first. The alarm sounds as it always has. The sunlight enters the room in the same quiet way. The responsibilities waiting outside your door have not disappeared. Life has not suddenly become free from uncertainty or challenge, yet something within you has changed. Earlier, you often woke carrying emotional weight that had quietly survived the night. Before the day had even begun, yesterday's disappointments were already waiting. Old conversations returned before your feet touched the floor. Familiar worries greeted you before your first thought had fully formed. The body may have rested, but the mind often woke exactly where it had fallen asleep. Now, another experience slowly begins replacing that familiar pattern. Morning no longer feels like the continuation of unfinished emotional battles. It begins feeling like the beginning of something genuinely new. That difference changes far more than your mood. It quietly changes the way you enter every day that follows. This shift happens because your evenings are no longer spent strengthening the burdens you once carried automatically. Earlier, unresolved emotions often followed you into sleep without being acknowledged or understood. They remained active beneath awareness, quietly preparing to reappear with the morning. Waking up felt less like starting over and more like reopening a book that had never truly been closed. The same concerns immediately returned because they had never been given the opportunity to settle. As patient reflection becomes part of your nightly rhythm, those emotional patterns gradually lose their habit of accompanying you into another day. They are no longer repeatedly rehearsed before sleep, so they slowly stop becoming the first companions waiting when consciousness returns. Instead of immediately continuing yesterday's emotional story, your attention begins meeting the present moment with greater openness. This does not mean every morning suddenly feels perfect. Some days still begin with tiredness. Certain worries still appear because important responsibilities remain part of life. There are mornings when uncertainty quietly waits beside you before the day has fully unfolded. The difference is that these experiences no longer arrive carrying the accumulated weight of countless earlier moments. They belong more honestly to the day that is actually beginning. Fear is no longer amplified by weeks of repeated mental rehearsal. Frustration is no longer intensified by emotional residue that quietly survived another restless night. You meet today's experiences with today's awareness rather than yesterday's unfinished reactions. That simple distinction creates remarkable emotional clarity because the present finally receives the opportunity to exist without constantly competing against the past. Eventually, you realize that the greatest difference is not found in your mornings themselves, but in the person waking within them. The world outside remains unpredictable. Some days still bring unexpected setbacks. Others offer quiet joy. Many contain both. Yet beneath those changing circumstances, something steadier continues growing. You no longer wake already defeated by emotional weight, collected long before the new day had the chance to speak for itself. Instead, you wake with greater clarity, greater presence, and greater willingness to meet life as it truly is, rather than as old habits expected it to be. Each peaceful evening has quietly prepared you for this moment. Each honest reflection has removed another unnecessary burden from your shoulders. By the time morning arrives, you are no longer simply beginning another day. You are beginning it with a mind that has slowly learned how to leave yesterday where it belongs, making room for today's possibilities to unfold with fresh attention and quiet confidence. The Stoic path was never about controlling life itself, because life has always remained beyond complete human control. Seasons change without asking permission. People make choices you cannot predict. Opportunities appear unexpectedly, then disappear just as quickly. Health shifts, relationships evolve, plans succeed, then suddenly unravel. Every generation has faced these same realities, even though the details have changed across centuries. The Stoics never promised a life free from uncertainty because they understood that such a promise could never be fulfilled. Instead, they directed attention somewhere far more reliable. Rather than trying to control the endless movement of the world, they encouraged people to strengthen the one place where lasting stability could actually be cultivated. That place was not found in perfect circumstances, flawless planning, or favorable outcomes. It was found within the quality of the mind meeting whatever circumstances happened to arrive. This quiet shift in focus changes everything because it frees you from spending your life fighting battles that were never yours to win in the first place. Earlier, it may have seemed that peace depended upon arranging life carefully enough that nothing unexpected could disturb it. If everyone behaved fairly, if every plan succeeded, if every important relationship remained stable, then perhaps calm would finally become permanent. Experience slowly reveals another truth. No amount of preparation can remove uncertainty completely. Even the most thoughtful plans eventually meet circumstances beyond anyone's influence. Trying to guarantee a life without disappointment becomes an endless pursuit because every solved problem eventually gives way to another challenge waiting somewhere ahead. The Stoic approach does not deny this reality. It accepts it with remarkable honesty. Once you stop demanding certainty from an uncertain world, enormous emotional energy becomes available for something far more meaningful. Instead of endlessly attempting to reshape every external event, you begin quietly reshaping the way you meet those events when they arrive. This understanding grows stronger through the simple discipline of nightly reflection. Each evening reminds you that much of your suffering was never created by events alone. It often grew from the stories attached to those events, the assumptions repeated without question, and the emotional habits carried forward long after the original moment had ended. By observing these patterns patiently before sleep, you gradually strengthen something deeper than temporary emotional comfort. You strengthen your capacity to remain steady regardless of what tomorrow may contain. The goal is not to predict every challenge. It is to become the kind of person capable of meeting challenges without immediately surrendering your inner balance. That distinction quietly changes the purpose of every evening, because reflection is no longer merely reviewing the day. It becomes another opportunity to prepare the mind for whatever the next one brings. Preparation of this kind looks very different from ordinary preparation. When people prepare for uncertain situations, they often gather more information, create additional plans, or imagine every possible outcome in the hope of avoiding future discomfort. Practical preparation certainly has its place, but emotional preparation follows another path. It teaches the mind that uncertainty itself does not have to become an enemy. A difficult conversation may happen, a disappointment may arrive, plans may change without warning. None of those possibilities automatically determine your emotional response. By repeatedly practicing awareness, patience, and honest reflection, you quietly develop confidence in something far more dependable than favorable circumstances. You begin trusting your ability to remain present regardless of what unfolds. That confidence cannot eliminate hardship, but it transforms the way hardship is experienced, because your stability no longer depends entirely upon external conditions remaining exactly as you hoped. This is why calmness gradually becomes more resilient. Earlier, your peace may have felt fragile because it relied upon everything going according to plan. One unexpected event could quietly unravel the emotional balance you had spent days trying to build. As your understanding deepens, calmness begins resting upon another foundation. It no longer asks life to become predictable before allowing you to feel settled. Instead, it quietly accompanies you into uncertainty itself. This does not remove sadness during loss or disappointment during failure. Those emotions remain honest parts of being human. What changes is that they no longer convince you that your inner stability has disappeared. Beneath every changing emotion, something steadier continues remaining present. The storms still arrive, but they no longer uproot everything they touch, because the roots beneath them have grown much deeper than before. Night after night, this steadiness develops through repeated practice rather than dramatic effort. The evenings teach you to notice emotional reactions before they quietly become emotional habits. They teach you to examine thoughts without automatically believing every conclusion they offer. They teach you to distinguish between what deserves your attention and what simply asks for another unnecessary rehearsal. As Epictetus observed, no great thing is created suddenly. None of these practices remove uncertainty from tomorrow, but together they quietly prepare you to enter tomorrow with a different state of mind. The subconscious gradually adopts this rhythm until responding thoughtfully becomes more familiar than reacting impulsively. What once required deliberate effort slowly becomes part of your character, because consistency has gently replaced intensity as your greatest teacher. The effects eventually reach every area of life. Relationships become steadier because other people's behavior no longer determines your emotional foundation. Work becomes less overwhelming because setbacks are experienced as temporary events rather than permanent judgments about your worth. Even ordinary inconveniences lose much of their power because your attention no longer magnifies them into something larger than they truly are. The world itself has not become easier. the person experiencing the world has quietly become stronger. This strength is not loud or dramatic. It does not demand recognition. It reveals itself in ordinary moments, when patience quietly replaces frustration, when understanding arrives before anger, and when presence remains available despite uncertainty. These are the moments that demonstrate how deeply the practice has taken root. Eventually, you recognize that the Stoic path was never asking you to master the world around you. That task was always impossible. It was inviting you to cultivate mastery over the conversations taking place within your own mind. Each peaceful evening became another opportunity to strengthen that quiet discipline. Each morning became another chance to carry it into the unpredictable flow of ordinary life. Challenges continue arriving because they always will. Circumstances continue changing because that is their nature. Yet something within you remains increasingly steady because it has stopped depending upon those circumstances for its stability. That is where lasting freedom quietly begins. Not in controlling everything life places before you, but in preparing your own mind so completely that whatever life brings, it no longer possesses the power to take away the peace you have patiently built, one honest night after another. This preparation continues every single evening, whether you notice it or not. Every night becomes a quiet turning point between one chapter and the next. The day gradually comes to an end, conversations fade into silence, responsibilities loosen their grip for a few hours, and the mind is finally given the opportunity to look inward without constant interruption. For many people, these moments pass unnoticed. The evening becomes nothing more than the final stretch before sleep, another routine repeated without much thought. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm lies one of the most important opportunities for inner change. Every night asks the same quiet question: what deserves to be carried into tomorrow, and what has already served its purpose? The answer to that question shapes far more than the quality of your sleep. It quietly shapes the emotional foundation upon which the next day will be built. Long before tomorrow begins, your mind is already deciding what version of yourself will greet it. Most emotional burdens do not become heavy all at once. They grow through accumulation. One small disappointment rarely changes a person's life. One difficult conversation rarely creates lasting resentment. One anxious thought seldom becomes permanent fear. The weight develops because these experiences continue traveling forward without ever being examined. They quietly attach themselves to the next day, then the next, until they become so familiar that carrying them no longer feels unusual. What was once temporary gradually becomes part of everyday life. Many people spend years believing life itself has become heavier when, in reality, they have simply forgotten what it feels like to place certain burdens down. The habit of carrying everything begins looking like responsibility, even though much of that weight was never meant to travel so far. This is why the evening deserves far more attention than it usually receives. It offers a natural pause before another cycle begins. During the day, events happen quickly. Decisions demand immediate action. Conversations unfold before there is time to fully understand them. Reflection often has to wait because life continues moving forward. Night changes that rhythm. It quietly creates enough distance between experience and reaction for understanding to emerge. Instead of immediately rushing into tomorrow while still carrying yesterday's emotional weight, you are given another opportunity to examine what truly belongs with you. Some lessons deserve to continue because they contain wisdom. Some emotions deserve acknowledgement because they still have something meaningful to reveal. Others have already completed their purpose and remain present only because habit keeps inviting them back. The quiet discipline of evening reflection helps you recognize the difference. At first, this practice may feel unfamiliar because the mind has spent years believing that every unresolved thought requires endless attention. It quietly assumes that repeating a problem is the same as solving it. Yet repetition without understanding rarely produces clarity. More often, it simply strengthens the emotional habits surrounding the experience. You replay the same conversation, you revisit the same disappointment. You imagine the same future difficulties. Nothing new is discovered, yet the emotional pathway becomes easier to follow each time it is repeated. Evening reflection interrupts this cycle. It gently asks whether another hour of rehearsal will truly create wisdom, or whether it will simply create another layer of unnecessary emotional weight. That single question quietly changes the direction of your attention, because it reminds you that not every thought deserves another performance. As this habit becomes more familiar, letting go begins feeling less like losing something important and more like returning things to their proper place. Earlier, releasing emotional burdens may have felt irresponsible, almost as though forgetting meant failing to learn. Gradually, another understanding appears. You realize that wisdom does not require constant emotional attachment. A lesson can remain even after the suffering surrounding it has softened. A memory can continue offering perspective without demanding another evening of endless mental repetition. This realization brings remarkable relief because it separates learning from carrying. You begin keeping what strengthens your character while quietly releasing what merely exhausts your spirit. The mind feels lighter, not because it remembers less, but because it no longer insists upon carrying everything equally. This quiet preparation also changes the way tomorrow begins. Instead of waking beneath the accumulated weight of countless unfinished emotional conversations, you begin meeting the morning with greater openness. The challenges waiting ahead remain real, but they no longer arrive alongside unnecessary burdens collected from previous days. Your attention becomes more available because less of it remains trapped inside experiences that have already ended. Presence grows naturally when the mind is no longer crowded by emotional residue. The day feels clearer because the evening before was spent creating space instead of adding more weight. One quiet act of reflection becomes another gift offered to the future version of yourself who will wake a few hours later. There is something deeply reassuring about recognizing that this opportunity never disappears. Every evening offers another beginning, regardless of how difficult the day may have been. Some days end with satisfaction. Others conclude beneath disappointment or uncertainty. The invitation remains the same. Pause, observe honestly, recognize what deserves to remain and what quietly asks to be released. No single evening has to accomplish everything. There is no pressure to solve every emotional question before sleep arrives. The practice succeeds not because each night is perfect, but because each night offers another opportunity to continue. Consistency quietly accomplishes what occasional determination rarely can. Small moments of honest awareness accumulate until they gradually reshape the deeper patterns guiding everyday life. This understanding removes another unnecessary burden as well. You stop expecting one extraordinary breakthrough to permanently transform your inner world. Instead, you begin trusting ordinary evenings. You trust the quiet moments when no dramatic insight appears, but awareness still remains present. You trust the evenings when all you manage to do is notice an old emotional habit before gently choosing not to strengthen it again. Those moments may seem insignificant while they are happening, yet they slowly become the foundation of lasting change. Character is rarely built through extraordinary events alone. It is quietly strengthened through ordinary decisions, repeated often enough that they become part of who you naturally are. Eventually, the evening becomes more than the final part of another day. It becomes an act of quiet preparation for the life you are continuing to build. Each night offers another opportunity to release unnecessary burdens before they quietly become tomorrow's obstacles. Each moment of honest reflection prevents another layer of emotional weight from following you into the future. The world outside will continue presenting uncertainty because that is simply its nature. Yet within that uncertainty, you begin carrying something steadier than before. Not because life has become easier, but because every peaceful evening has quietly reminded you that tomorrow deserves your presence, not the unnecessary burdens of yesterday. One night at a time, that simple practice becomes the bridge between the person you have been and the person you are patiently becoming. Eventually, people begin noticing something different about your presence, even if they cannot explain exactly what has changed. It is not something visible in the way you dress or something easily measured by outward success. It appears in quieter ways. Conversations with you seem less hurried. Difficult situations no longer pull you into immediate emotional reactions. Your attention feels more settled because it is no longer constantly divided between the present moment and old pain that keeps demanding another rehearsal. Earlier, much of your mental energy remained occupied by experiences that had already ended. Regrets quietly accompanied ordinary conversations. Worries interrupted peaceful moments before they had the opportunity to fully exist. The past repeatedly reached into the present, asking for another opportunity to shape your emotional state. As those habits gradually weaken, another quality begins taking their place. Calmness quietly settles where urgency once lived. It is not forced. It simply emerges because the mind has finally stopped carrying battles that no longer need to be fought. People often respond differently to calmness because it changes the emotional atmosphere around them. A conversation that might have become an argument begins slowing down because one person is no longer feeding the momentum of frustration. Someone else's impatience no longer automatically becomes your own. An unexpected problem appears, yet instead of spreading anxiety through everyone involved, your steadiness quietly creates room for thoughtful action. None of this happens because you are trying to influence others. It happens because emotional stability naturally affects the environment surrounding it. Just as panic often spreads from one person to another, calmness carries its own quiet influence. Others begin feeling it before they understand where it comes from. They simply notice that being around you feels different than it once did. The reason for this difference reaches much deeper than behavior alone. Your mind is no longer constantly rehearsing old pain beneath every new experience. Earlier, every situation quietly competed against memories that had never been fully released. A simple disagreement awakened old rejection. A temporary setback reopened earlier disappointments. New relationships carried invisible expectations created by past experiences. Even peaceful moments were interrupted by emotional conversations that had ended long ago. Through patient reflection, those patterns gradually lost their place. The past remains part of your story, but it no longer insists upon participating in every present moment. Because of that, your attention becomes more available. You listen more completely. You notice more clearly. You respond to what is actually happening instead of unconsciously reacting to something that happened years before. This presence becomes especially noticeable during moments that once would have unsettled you. Someone offers criticism, and although you consider it carefully, it no longer defines your entire sense of worth. Plans unexpectedly change, yet flexibility appears before frustration has the opportunity to take over. Uncertainty enters your life, but instead of demanding immediate certainty, you quietly accept that not every answer needs to arrive today. These responses are not performances. They are the natural result of countless evenings spent practicing another way of meeting your own thoughts. The discipline developed in silence quietly reveals itself when life becomes noisy again. Long before you consciously recognize how much you have changed, your actions begin reflecting that transformation in ordinary situations. Another subtle shift begins appearing in the way you carry yourself through the day. Earlier, your attention often seemed pulled in many different directions at once. Part of your mind remained trapped inside yesterday, while another part worried about tomorrow. The present received only whatever attention remained. As emotional burdens become lighter, Your awareness gradually gathers itself into one place. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, confine yourself to the present. You become more available for conversations because your thoughts are no longer constantly elsewhere. Simple experiences become richer because they are no longer competing with endless internal rehearsals. Even silence changes. Earlier, silence often invited old worries to return. Now it becomes a place where your mind naturally rests, instead of automatically searching for another problem to solve. This quiet steadiness also changes the way people trust you. They begin recognizing that your reactions are no longer unpredictable. You do not become overwhelmed by every inconvenience or carried away by every passing emotion. This consistency creates a sense of reliability that extends far beyond words. Others begin feeling safe, sharing difficult conversations, because they know they will be met with patience rather than immediate judgment. Your calmness does not solve every problem for them, but it often creates enough space for better conversations to unfold. Without trying to become a source of stability for others, you naturally begin offering it, because you have first learned how to cultivate it within yourself. Perhaps the most meaningful part of this transformation is that it requires no constant effort to maintain. Earlier, appearing calm may have felt like another task requiring endless self-control. Now calmness grows more naturally because it is no longer something placed on top of inner chaos. The chaos itself has gradually become quieter. You no longer spend every evening strengthening old fears, replaying painful memories, or preparing for disappointments that have not happened. Those habits slowly gave way to observation, acceptance, and patient understanding. As those healthier patterns settled into the subconscious, urgency quietly lost the constant reinforcement that once kept it alive. Calmness no longer feels borrowed or temporary. It begins feeling like home. Eventually, you understand why people notice something different without always finding the right words to describe it. They are not responding to perfection because you remain fully human. Difficult emotions still visit. Challenges continue arriving without warning. Life remains uncertain because uncertainty is woven into its nature. What they notice is the absence of constant internal conflict. Your mind is no longer endlessly rehearsing yesterday's pain while trying to survive today. Presence has quietly replaced preoccupation. Steadiness has replaced unnecessary urgency. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." The countless evenings spent releasing emotional burdens have slowly become visible in the way you move through ordinary life. Without announcing the change or seeking recognition for it, you carry a quieter strength into every conversation, every challenge, and every new morning. That quiet strength becomes one of the clearest signs that real transformation has already taken place, not because the world around you has finally become peaceful, but because the world within you no longer depends upon constant emotional struggle to feel alive. Looking back, you eventually realize that the greatest healing did not happen during extraordinary moments. It did not arrive through one life-changing conversation, one powerful realization, or one perfect evening where everything suddenly became clear. Those dramatic moments may have inspired you, but they were never the true source of lasting change. The deepest transformation unfolded so quietly that you almost missed it while it was happening. It was built through countless ordinary nights that seemed completely unremarkable at the time. Nights when you simply sat with your thoughts instead of running from them. Nights when you chose understanding instead of another hour of mental resistance. Nights when no great breakthrough appeared, yet you still remained present long enough to notice what your own mind had been trying to tell you. Those evenings never asked for recognition. They simply continued shaping you one small decision at a time until the person waking each morning was no longer quite the same as the one who had gone to sleep the night before. This realization often arrives only after enough time has passed to see the larger pattern. While living through the process, progress rarely feels dramatic. You still encounter difficult emotions, Old memories continue returning from time to time. Some evenings feel peaceful, while others feel restless despite your best efforts. It becomes easy to believe that nothing meaningful is changing because the differences appear too small to notice from one day to the next. Yet the mind rarely transforms in ways that demand immediate attention. It changes the same way nature changes. One leaf falling from a tree tells you very little about the coming season. One sunrise does not reveal how much the landscape will transform over an entire year. It is only after many quiet moments have gathered together that their true significance becomes visible. The same is true of your inner life. The person you become is not created through one extraordinary night. That person is patiently formed through hundreds of ordinary ones. There is something deeply comforting about this truth because it removes the pressure to constantly search for dramatic emotional breakthroughs. Earlier, you may have believed healing required a single unforgettable experience that would finally erase every burden you carried. You waited for one perfect insight, capable of explaining everything that had ever hurt you. Gradually, life revealed another path. Healing was never hidden inside one extraordinary answer. It quietly unfolded through repeated acts of honesty. Every evening you noticed a thought without immediately believing it. Every night you allowed an uncomfortable emotion to exist without trying to silence it. Every moment you chose patience instead of harsh self-judgment became another quiet step forward. None of those moments seemed impressive in isolation, yet together they slowly changed the direction of your entire life. The extraordinary was quietly built from the ordinary, one peaceful evening after another. This understanding also changes the way you think about progress. Earlier, progress was measured by how different you hope to feel tomorrow. Now it is measured by how differently you respond today compared to who you were months ago. Perhaps you recover from disappointment more quickly than before. Perhaps criticism no longer occupies your thoughts for an entire week. Perhaps silence has become a place of rest instead of another opportunity for anxiety to grow louder. These changes seem almost too subtle to celebrate, yet they reveal something profound. Character rarely announces its own growth. It simply becomes visible through the countless situations that no longer affect you the way they once did. You stop looking for dramatic evidence because your daily life quietly becomes the evidence. The evenings themselves also begin feeling different. Earlier, they often carried the emotional weight of unfinished conversations, regrets, and imagined futures. They became places where the mind endlessly repeated experiences that had already ended. As your practice deepened, those same evenings slowly transformed into something gentler. They became opportunities to understand rather than escape. The silence that once felt intimidating gradually became familiar. Reflection stopped feeling like another burden and began feeling like an act of quiet care toward yourself. You no longer entered the night expecting to solve every problem before morning arrived. You simply arrived with honesty, trusting that awareness itself was already moving you in the right direction. That trust became one of the greatest gifts those ordinary nights quietly offered. Another beautiful realization begins appearing alongside this one. You discover that consistency quietly possesses a kind of wisdom that motivation alone can never provide. Motivation arrives with excitement but often leaves just as quickly. Consistency remains after excitement has faded. It returns on ordinary evenings when nothing particularly meaningful seems to be happening. It continues practicing patience when progress feels invisible. It chooses awareness, even when the mind insists nothing is changing. Looking back, you recognize that consistency accomplished what inspiration alone never could. The evenings when you least felt like reflecting often became just as important as the evenings filled with clarity, because they strengthened the habit rather than depending upon emotion. The subconscious quietly learned that this new way of living was no longer temporary. It had become part of your character. As these realizations settle more deeply, gratitude naturally begins replacing frustration. Instead of regretting how slowly healing unfolded, you appreciate why it needed time. A hurried transformation could never have developed the depth that steady repetition quietly created. Every challenge taught another layer of patience. Every difficult evening strengthened another layer of awareness. Every ordinary night added another small piece to a foundation that eventually became strong enough to support genuine peace. Nothing was wasted. Even the evenings that felt unsuccessful quietly contributed because they reminded you to return again the following night. Healing became less about perfect reflection and more about faithful return. That simple willingness to begin again, no matter how ordinary the evening seemed, slowly became one of your greatest strengths. Eventually, you understand that the life you were hoping to build was never waiting somewhere far ahead in the future. It was quietly taking shape every time you chose honest reflection instead of unconscious repetition. As Seneca wrote, "As is a tale, so is life. Not how long it is, but how good it is what matters." Every ordinary night carried within it the possibility of becoming part of something much larger than itself. One evening alone could not transform a person, but hundreds of evenings patiently lived with awareness could. Looking back, the greatest healing was never hidden inside dramatic moments that everyone could see. It unfolded quietly while the world slept, through countless ordinary nights where you gently released another unnecessary burden, understood another hidden pattern, forgave another part of yourself, and prepared your mind for another peaceful morning. Those simple moments never demanded attention, yet together they became the quiet masterpiece of your transformation, proving that the deepest changes in life are often the ones that happen so gradually they are recognized only after they have already become part of who you are. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. Lasting peace is rarely created while the world is watching. It is not built through dramatic declarations or extraordinary moments that invite recognition from others. It grows quietly, away from applause, in places that most people never see. It is shaped during ordinary evenings when the noise of the day finally settles and your attention gently returns to yourself. Those moments often appear insignificant because nothing remarkable seems to be happening. The room is quiet. The responsibilities of the day are over. No one else knows what thoughts are passing through your mind. Yet those silent moments quietly become the workshop where your character continues taking shape. Every evening offers another opportunity to decide whether the mind will spend another night strengthening old fears or patiently cultivating greater understanding. That decision rarely feels dramatic while it is being made, but over time it influences nearly every part of the life waiting for you tomorrow. Many people search for peace in places where it cannot permanently remain. They look for it inside achievements, believing one more success will finally quiet the restlessness within. They search for it inside other people's approval, hoping recognition will silence years of self-doubt. Others wait for life itself to become predictable before allowing themselves to feel settled. Yet every one of those sources remains uncertain because they depend upon circumstances that constantly change. Success comes and goes. Opinions shift. Life continues surprising everyone without asking permission first. If peace depends entirely upon these changing conditions, it becomes just as unstable as the circumstances supporting it. The quieter path asks something different. Instead of searching endlessly for external certainty, it patiently builds an inner foundation capable of remaining steady even while the world continues changing around it. That foundation is not constructed in public moments of achievement. It is quietly strengthened in private moments of honest reflection. This is why the evening carries such unusual importance. It marks the final conversation between you and yourself before another day begins. Long after the world has grown quiet, another opportunity quietly appears. You can repeat the same emotional habits that have followed you for years, or you can gently interrupt them before they become tomorrow's first thoughts. Neither choice feels especially significant in isolation. It is simply another evening, Another ordinary night, another opportunity that seems almost identical to countless nights before it. Yet the subconscious quietly notices these repeated decisions. It remembers where your attention consistently returns. If every night ends with endless worry, worry gradually becomes familiar. If each evening closes with honest awareness, patient acceptance, and thoughtful reflection, those qualities slowly become familiar instead. The subconscious does not change because of occasional inspiration. It changes because repetition quietly teaches it what belongs. As the weeks become months, something remarkable begins happening beneath awareness. The mind that once worked against you slowly begins working with you instead. Earlier, silence often invited old fears to grow louder. Rest became difficult because unfinished emotional conversations followed you into sleep without interruption. Morning arrived carrying the same burdens that had accompanied the previous evening. Gradually, another rhythm begins taking shape. Reflection replaces emotional accumulation. Understanding quietly interrupts endless repetition. As Seneca observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. The thoughts accompanying you into sleep become gentler, more balanced, and more honest. Without forcing anything, the subconscious begins reinforcing these healthier patterns while you rest. The night itself becomes part of your growth, rather than another place where old habits quietly become stronger. Sleep stops feeling like an escape from your own mind and becomes a quiet partnership with it. This partnership changes the quality of ordinary life in ways that cannot always be measured immediately. Challenges continue arriving because uncertainty remains part of being human. Difficult conversations still happen. Unexpected disappointments still appear without warning. Yet your relationship with these experiences becomes noticeably different. Earlier, every emotional wave threatened to carry you away because the mind had spent years rehearsing instability. Now another habit quietly supports you. Awareness arrives before impulse. Patience appears before unnecessary reaction. Perspective gently softens conclusions that once felt absolute. None of these changes remove difficulty from life. They simply prevent difficulty from becoming the only reality your mind can see. The subconscious has gradually learned another language, one spoken through steadiness rather than urgency, understanding rather than endless emotional rehearsal. Perhaps the most beautiful part of this transformation is that nobody else needs to recognize it for it to remain meaningful. Some of the greatest victories you will ever experience happen entirely within your own awareness. No audience applauds the evening you choose forgiveness instead of another hour of resentment. No celebration follows the night you quietly release a burden you have carried for years. No one notices the moment your first reaction softens into patient observation instead of immediate judgment. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Yet these invisible victories gradually become the strongest parts of your character. They influence every conversation, every decision, every relationship, and every morning that follows. What begins in silence eventually becomes visible in the way you move through the world, even if few people ever understand where that quiet strength was born. This understanding also removes the pressure to become someone entirely different overnight. You stop demanding extraordinary transformation from a single evening because you have learned to trust ordinary faithfulness instead. Every peaceful night contributes something meaningful, even when no dramatic realization appears. Every honest reflection gently weakens another unnecessary habit. Every moment spent observing, instead of automatically reacting quietly, strengthens another layer of inner stability. These small acts accumulate beyond what the conscious mind can immediately perceive. The subconscious continues learning while you sleep, patiently organizing the repeated lessons you have offered it with quiet consistency. Little by little, the person waking each morning becomes calmer, clearer, and more present, because the nights have slowly taught the mind another way of living. In the end, peace reveals itself as something much simpler than most people imagine. It is not a reward waiting at the end of perfect circumstances. It is not reserved for those whose lives unfold without hardship. It is patiently built through ordinary choices, repeated in moments that seem too quiet to matter. One intentional night at a time, you gently teach your mind that it no longer needs to fight every memory, predict every future, or carry every burden into another sunrise. The subconscious gradually accepts that lesson until it begins supporting the life you are intentionally creating, instead of repeating the one you have already outgrown. That is where the deepest freedom quietly begins. Not while the world is watching, not through extraordinary moments that demand attention, but in the stillness of one honest evening after another, until the silence itself becomes the place where your mind finally learns to work beside you instead of against you, and every peaceful night becomes another quiet promise kept to the person you are steadily becoming. The world will still change tomorrow. Challenges will still appear. Uncertainty will still arrive without asking permission. But tonight, you have something many people spend their entire lives searching for. The understanding that real peace is not found by escaping life, but by preparing your mind to meet it with clarity, patience, and quiet strength. Night after night, those small moments of honest reflection become something far greater than they first appear. They become the foundation of a life no longer ruled by old fears, but guided by conscious presence. If this journey has spoken to something within you, don't let the reflection end here. Continue strengthening your mind by watching one of the videos now appearing on your screen. Each one builds on these same timeless principles and will help you continue developing the calm, discipline, and inner freedom that grow one day and one night at a time. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, rest well, reflect deeply, and continue becoming the person your mind has quietly been preparing you to be.